As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Mr. Speaker, this may be the last time I speak on the House floor. At the end of the year, I'll leave Congress after 23 years in office over a 36-year period. My goals in 1976 were the same as they are today: promote peace and prosperity by a strict adherence to the principles of individual liberty. It was my opinion that the course of the U.S. embarked on in the latter part of the 20th century would bring us a major financial crisis and engulf us in a foreign policy that would overextend us and undermine our national security. To achieve these goals, I sought the government would have had to shrink in size and scope, reduce spending, change the monetary system, and reject the unsustainable costs of policing the world and expanding the American empire. The problems seem to be overwhelming and impossible to solve, yet from my viewpoint, just following the constraints placed on the federal government by the Constitution would have been a good place to start. Just how much did I accomplish? In many ways, according to conventional wisdom, my off and on career in Congress from 1976 to 2012 accomplished very little. No name legislation, no name federal buildings or highways, thank goodness. In spite of my efforts, the government has grown exponentially, taxes remain excessive, and the prolific increase of incomprehensible regulations continues. Wars are constant and pursued without congressional declaration, deficits rise to the sky, poverty is rampant, and dependency on the federal government is now worse than any time in our history. All this with minimal concerns for the deficits and unfunded liabilities that common sense tells us cannot go on much longer. A grand but never mentioned bipartisan agreement allows for the well-kept secret that keeps the spending going. One side doesn't give up 1 penny on military spending, the other side doesn't give up 1 penny on welfare spending, while both sides support the bailouts and the subsidies for the banking and the corporate elite. And the spending continues as the economy weakens and the downward spiral continues. As the government continues fiddling around, our liberties and our wealth burn in the flames of a foreign policy that makes us less safe. The major stumbling block to real change in Washington is the total resistance to admitting that the country is broke. This has made compromising just to agree to increase spending inevitable, since neither side has any intention on cutting spending. The country and the Congress will remain divisive since there's no loot left to divvy up. Without this recognition, the spenders in Washington will continue to march toward a fiscal cliff much bigger than the one anticipated this coming January. I've thought a lot about why those of us who believe in liberty as a solution have done so poorly in convincing others of its benefits. If liberty is what we claim it is, the principle that protects all personal, social, and economic decisions necessary for maximum prosperity and the best chance for peace, it should be an easy sell. Yet history has shown that the masses have been quite receptive to the promises of authoritarians, which are rarely, if ever, fulfilled. Should we have authoritarianism or liberty? If authoritarianism leads to poverty and war and less freedom for all individuals and is controlled by rich special interests, the people should be begging for liberty. There certainly was a strong enough sentiment for more freedom at the time of our founding that motivated those who were willing to fight in the revolution against the powerful British government. During my time in Congress, the appetite for liberty has been quite weak. The understanding of its significance negligible. Yet the good news is that compared to 1976, when I first came to Congress, the desire for more freedom and less government in 2012 is much greater and growing, especially in grassroots America. Tens of thousands of teenagers and college-age students are, with great enthusiasm, welcoming the message of liberty.
So attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria have continued through the weekend, after the U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria early Friday. So Lebanon's Al Mayadeen, media outlet based in Lebanon, they reported that a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq said that it successfully targeted the U.S.'s al-Shaddadi base in Syria, which is located in northeastern Syria's al-Hasaka province. And this was on Sunday that they claimed this attack. And the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK, they also reported a drone attack on the al-Shaddadi base. So it was reported by multiple sources. And their report said that explosions were heard in the area and that smoke columns rose from the base. Al-Mayadeen also reported an overnight attack on a U.S. base in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province. So these attacks that happened on Sunday have not yet been confirmed by the U.S. military. U.S. officials have confirmed to the Associated Press that a U.S. base in eastern Syria came under attack on Friday after the U.S. launched those airstrikes. And U.S. officials also said a drone was fired at the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq, which houses U.S. troops. And they say that drone was shot down. No casualties have been reported yet in these attacks, but again, I don't think we know the full picture yet. And another thing, I haven't seen any reports of casualties in the U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria, so we'll see if more comes out about that. But, you know, the U.S. is saying, the White House is saying one purpose of these airstrikes that they launched in eastern Syria was to deter further attacks. And I know I've talked about this before, but the U.S. has, you know, under Biden, it happened a lot under Trump too, has launched airstrikes like this against the Shia militias in Iraq that operate in Iraq and Syria. And sometimes they respond, sometimes they back down. And I suspected with everything that's going on in Gaza that they weren't going to back down, and they haven't. And the White House is saying that the purpose of the strikes was to deter further attacks. Clearly that is a failed strategy. A new House Speaker says Russia, China, and Iran are the new axis of evil. So we got a new speaker and we got a new axis of evil. So Johnson, and this was in an interview, I think with Sean Hannity this past Thursday night. So he told Sean, it's right there. I should have just kept reading. He told Sean Hannity that China, Russia, and Iran make up an axis of evil that poses a huge threat to the U.S. So he said, quote, big priorities in this moment right now. We have Israel being attacked. We have unrest. We have the Ukraine situation we've got to deal with. We have China being aggressive. We have Iran with all the meddling, and China, Russia, and Iran working together. This is a dangerous time. Hamas and Hezbollah are proxies of Iran, and they're tied in now with Russia and China. I mean, it is a new axis of evil. That is how we see it, end quote. And claiming that these countries pose the biggest threat since World War II. And he also, again, supported continuing funding the proxy war in Ukraine. He said, quote, now we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there. And it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, end quote. So even though Mr. Johnson here got an F on his report card from the neocons over at that, Republicans for Ukraine, this new group that they formed, it looks like he's going to go ahead and make sure the Ukraine war keeps getting funded, but the priority for him is Israel, but I don't think that means that they're not going to get the Ukraine aid. And it says that 2 months before Hamas attacked Israel, the Pentagon awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to build U.S. troop facilities for a secret base it maintains deep within Israel's Negev desert, just 20 miles from Gaza, code-named Site 512. Site 512. The long-standing U.S. base is a radar facility that monitors the skies for missile attacks on Israel. On October 7th, however, when thousands of Hamas rockets were launched, Site 512 saw nothing because it is focused on Iran more than 700 miles away. The U.S. Army is quietly moving ahead with construction at Site 512, a classified base perched atop Mount Har Karen in the Negev, to include what government records describe as a life support facility, which is military speak for barracks-like structures for personnel. Though President Joe Biden and the White House insist that there are no plans to send U.S. troops to Israel amid its war on Hamas, a secret U.S. military presence is already in existence, and the government contracts and budget documents show it is evidently growing. The $35.8 million U.S. troops facility, not publicly announced or previously reported, was obliquely referenced in an August 2nd contract announcement by the Pentagon. So, you know, this is definitely something that they had the ball rolling on already. And now with all this stuff with Gaza and just the situation in the region, I'm sure that they're going to maybe even ramp this thing up to build it quicker, to get, you know, U.S. troops in there. And like they mentioned in this article, this site with all these radars, we're looking at Iran. So now that they think there might be a big regional war and they want to help Israel, protect Israel, again, I could just see them speeding, you know, these plans up.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Like, I mean, you could think like Hamas are a bunch of idiots. They pulled off a pretty coordinated, sophisticated attack on the most prepared country in the world, so maybe they're not that stupid. But what do you think they thought the response was going to be to this? They obviously knew Israel was going to go. Now, this is the whole point. This is the whole point of 9/11 was to provoke us into invading Afghanistan, where empires go to die. And this was the whole point of this, was to overreact and then turn the entire Muslim world against them and have all of Arabia, you know what I mean, like pissed off at them. And so what's really rewarding the terrorists? Like, I think you could make an argument that it's like, it would actually be less of a reward for them if you didn't fall into their trap. And then you go, you know, well, what's the reward for like the innocent people who are not terrorists? Well, it would definitely be a reward to not kill them and their families. And it would definitely, you know, look, however you feel about Osama bin Laden, let's say, because sometimes I'd get in these arguments with neocons where they'd be like, hey, he may say that the reason he hates America is because of our support for Israel and us propping up brutal dictators in the region, and that we killed so many people with the sanction blockade around Iraq, and that we've killed so many innocent Muslims. He may say that's why he hates us, but why he really hates us is because he's just pure evil. And now it's like, okay, yeah, I guess we can compete over psychoanalyzing the guy, but neither of us know what's in his heart, whatever. But how does he recruit people? How does he get so many people on his side? It's definitely by saying, look how horrible America's foreign policy is. And in fact, even our own FBI, because they've conducted like dozens and dozens of like entrapment, ploys where they get some young Muslim weirdo to like, detonate a bomb that's not real, and then they brag that they thwarted a terrorist attack.
Now give us more money so we can prevent even more.
Right. Now, every time when they approach those Muslim kids, you know what they do? They never approach them and go, and you can go look into the details, but take any case and you show me how they approach them. They never approach them by going, in the Quran it says this.
Right.
So don't you want to go kill these Americans?
Don't you feel bad for these victims?
Look at what they're doing.
Right.
Look at what they're doing in these wars. Look how many innocent Muslims and women have been shot. Are you going to let this happen to these little girls?
So the FBI knows how to radicalize someone.
Yes, they know exactly how to do it. Yes.
Yeah, that's wild.
So what is actually rewarding the terrorists and what isn't? It seems to me it would be rewarding them to boost their whole recruitment effort.
Right.
To like make to prove their narrative correct, at least partially, So anyway, it's really just amazing. It's I'll tell you, just a few weeks ago, I would have very confidently said that at least one of the neocons' major goals, which was war with Iran, had failed. And that whole, if you go back and listen to the Wesley Clark clip where he says in late 2001, he saw the plans already. By the way, that kind of lines up with what I was saying about letting Osama go. Because in late 2001, he's like, they already had the plans. And the plans weren't just, as he breaks down, it wasn't just that we were going to invade Iraq, which is bad enough, but that it was also that we're going to topple 7 Muslim countries in the next 5 years or whatever the exact numbers were. And the countries there were, if I'm remembering correctly, it was Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, I believe it was Lebanon, and maybe one others that I'm blanking on. Maybe it was Yemen. I can't remember. And then finally culminating with Iran. And we certainly got a lot of these, Sudan maybe, and we certainly got a lot of these, And now again, the attempt in Syria clearly failed when the Russians intervened. That's part of the reason why Russia's been the bad guy now since then. But a lot of these certainly did work, right? Like we had regime changes in a lot of these other countries. In Yemen, obviously we failed in Afghanistan as well, succeeded in Iraq, succeeded in Libya. But the Iran one, I was like, well, you just failed. Time ran out. And people in America are totally over regime change wars in the Middle East. So you didn't get the Iran one, thank God, because that's the toughest out of all of them. And now, the second this Hamas attack happens, every neocon is out pumping war with Iran. And you're kind of like, oh, they're back. They've been given a shot now to get this war that they always wanted. Whether that'll work or not, I'm still somewhat optimistic that it's just not possible. I think there's enough forces, even within the military, who resisted the neocons' demand for war with Iraq back in the day because they were like, we can't do this logistically. But it's pretty incredible to watch them say something like this. Like Blinken, it's like, what a reckless statement when, look.
Then we're with Russia.
Huh?
Also, by that standard, we're at war with Russia right now.
Oh yeah, right. Yes, but also the fact that you're like, okay, well, if American forces are attacked, but you're like, but where are the American forces exactly?
Oh yeah, that's
and you're like,
funny too.
Yeah, well, because we have forces in Lebanon, we have forces in Israel right now. We have these people like all over this region. We still have troops in Syria, and like, yeah, these are easy targets for Iran. But then it's also like he was very clear to say if Iran or any of their proxies. So now you're saying
some random other group.
Essentially, if a Shiite with a gun kills someone, you can now go, oh, that's war with Iran.
Right.
That's war with a country 3 times the size of Iraq.
Right.
Who can hit a lot of our targets and a lot of Israeli targets
and
pretty easily.
By the way, you don't even need to have targets hit. I mean, the cartoonish story, which I'm still confused about from a couple days ago, where they said Hamas said a hospital was blown up, and then Israel said, no, you blew up your hospital. And then Israel said, fine, you didn't blow up your own hospital. It was this other group of people, which I was like, wait, there's another group of people? Sounds like you probably shouldn't take out Hamas and have a power
Israel
vacuum.
had also already warned about hitting this hospital beforehand, which is why so many people assumed it was Israel to begin with.
Okay. But the point I'm trying to get at is we don't even know if targets are or are not being hit. And now there's apparently other groups of people who are just floating around in these areas. So you're telling me that someone who wants to get more hostilities going can't claim, look at this horrible thing that was, hey, we're going to, and look at what happened with the, when we said that there was going to be a red line of chemical weapons and they tried to pretend like chemical weapons had gone off in Syria. Yep. There's nothing quite like saying, hey, if anyone does this, then that's what's going to get us into this war as a,
well, that's part of the reason why it's so reckless, because then it's like, oh, well, now you've painted yourself into a corner where the outcome is at minimum a horrific war, substantially harder than the war in Iraq.
Right.
And at maximum, a world war. which might be triggered by this. You can already see so many countries lining up. And it does seem like between this thing in Ukraine and now this, like it's almost like, is the goal here World War III? Or are you just like, this World War III thing doesn't seem to be coming together in Ukraine the way we hoped, so let's see if we can't get it going over here. I'm not saying it is, but it would almost kind of make sense if that was the strategy.
You and Larry and the other guests and I have argued that the war in Ukraine has burst the myth of NATO and Western invincibility. You and Larry and the others and I have argued that the events of October 7 in Israel have burst the myth of Israeli invincibility. What has all of this done to the myth of American invincibility, indispensability, if you will, around the world?
Judge, it's made a very, very small dent in it. And the proof is in the pudding. A very important meeting took place Thursday, Friday, Saturday, when the Chinese foreign minister, who was also a member of the ruling Politburo, visited Washington. No progress at all. No indication that Xi Jinping will come to San Francisco for that Asian summit, and no indication even that military communication ties have been restored between China and the U.S. Instead, just a lot of rhetoric. The Chinese very bitter about this. Chinese warning that they will not tolerate this kind of thing unless, as they put it, unless Biden changes his mind and starts being reasonable. So probably Xi is not going to come to San Francisco, and probably the lack of military ties will persist. Now we have the Russian defense minister in Beijing as we speak, talking together with the Chinese defense minister. They're talking about their joint efforts to tamp down hostilities in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Who represents the United States? The country director for China in the Defense Department. That's telling in and of itself. Somebody of that low rank can't have much impact on what these key leaders think.
We'll get back to Israel in a minute. Is the United States being intentionally provocative militarily toward the Chinese? And if so, I think you're going to say yes, because we have a tape of this. Why?
Well, Judge, we talked on Friday about that Chinese fighter that came within 10 feet of a B-52 bomber in the South China Sea. Now, what's a B-52 bomber doing in the South China Sea? In August, there was an incredibly close encounter of the very close kind between a U.S. ship and a Chinese ship in the South China Sea.
Here we go, Ray.
Yeah, there's a video of that, I think. Let's see if I can.
The one on the left is the American, is the Chinese. The one on the right is the American, almost aiming for the bow, certainly crossing in front of it. No?
That's quite correct. Now, this is a Ministry of Defense video from the Chinese. Nobody has taken any issue with it. It's, pictures don't lie. It came very close to cutting off the Chinese ship. Chinese ship was going straight. Now, that's what happened in August. The Chinese remonstrated, but the U.S. said, no, freedom of navigation, we can do what we want. So the point here is that any one of these incidents could cause a real clash. And if there's a real clash, the Chinese are prepared for it. They're saying, look, if we clash in the air or on the sea, we're ready for that. What are you going to do 6, 7, 8,000 miles away?
Okay,
it's very dangerous.
Let me ask you this. Who would have made the decision for the U.S. warship to do that? The Chief of Naval Operations, that's the head admiral, the Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States. I mean, this is so provocative. What level of authority can authorize this, and what would have motivated it?
Well, this is routine procedure. In other words, it's SOP, standard operating procedure for U.S. warships and U.S. aircraft to patrol very close to the Chinese mainland. Now, why they do that? Well, they say it's to assert freedom of navigation and freedom of airspace. But I dare say, if you looked at the Chinese doing that in the Caribbean or the Russians, it's a provocative step. But the Navy can do it. The Navy says we will do it, and it's a long-standing procedure. The B-52s, I've tried to check on that. I'm not sure how often B-52s fly that close, because after all, B-52s are nuclear capable. They're also capable of firing cruise missiles and so forth. They're not reconnaissance aircraft. So yeah, these are deliberate provocations. They set off Chinese radar, but that's just a minor technical advantage. The real thing is to show who rules the South China Sea, and we're reluctant to admit that we can't really rule it anymore all by ourselves.
Tell me about intel capabilities on the Russian foreign minister and Chinese foreign minister communicating. Do we know what they're saying in real time from surveillance, or do we surmise what they're talking about?
What the Chinese and the Russian defense ministers are saying?
Yes.
Well, they're saying it in open forum just today. Reuters just reported that the Chinese are saying our relations with Russia have never been closer. We will face provocations together. And Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has referred to the nuclear option very, very obliquely and not saying anything new. But every time he says, risking war with a nuclear capable country like us doesn't make any sense. There's some indication that Reuters still hopes that Xi Jinping will go to San Francisco. I say forget about that. And Reuters also says, they're trying to set up military communications between China and the United States. They're hopeful of that. Well, that's already been shot down as a result of Wang Yi, the foreign minister's visit to Washington late last week. They're saying it all in public. And the whole contour of the world correlation of forces has changed to the disadvantage of the United States, which has gotten a short stick of this isosceles triangle that I refer to now and then.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
First up, GOP presidential hopeful and buffet extraordinaire, Chris Christie. Let's hear what he has to say.
We know that they hide behind the falsity of free speech. There's a difference, everyone, between free speech and hate speech.
Is this Ibram X. Kendi or is this a GOP presidential candidate, Chris Christie? I can't tell. Interesting. There's a difference between free speech and hate speech. Oh, is there now, Chris?
There's a difference between free speech and violence. There's a difference between incitement and free speech. And what's going on our college campuses today is not free speech.
Yeah, kind of it is, actually, Chris. That's exactly what it is. If people say, from the mountain to the sea or whatever, Palestine will be free. Like, look, you can say that it has undertones that you find disturbing, whatever. It's still free speech, though. Free speech isn't about language that is, accepted by all. The whole reason we have this entire precept is that we want to be able to say unpopular things. When did we forget this? The GOP, when it came to racism and transphobia, no such thing as hate speech. As soon as it's about Israel, hate speech is the light switch is flipped back on.
We have been here before, haven't we?
Yeah, we've been here before, debating whether or not free speech should be permissible. It was the foundation of our country, and we decided yes. And then we put it in the fucking Bill of Rights as number one, because we were like, yeah, we really mean this shit. We've had this debate before. Yeah, we have had this debate before. We already concluded. The answer is you can't do it. Constitutionally protected. Goodness gracious. I would very much like to not criminalize protests or speech. Could we not do that? Well, GOP, their donors say, yeah, we kind of do have to ban all that. Sick. Here's Donald Trump showing where his bread's buttered too.
On that terrible Saturday morning, the world saw once again that the conflict between Israel and Hamas is not a conflict between two equal sides. This is a fight between civilization and savagery, between decency and depravity, and between good and evil. There is no comparison between a group that worships death and a group that cherishes life and cherishes our nation. Every single life that is lost in this conflict is on the shoulders of Hamas alone.
Is this reminiscing at all to George W. Bush? I think if you play back the beginning of this episode, you'll hear a lot of similarities.
It arises directly from the Iraqi regime's own actions, its history of aggression, and its drive toward an arsenal of terror. It possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons. It is seeking nuclear weapons. Members of Congress of both political parties and members of the United Nations Security Council agree that Saddam Hussein is a threat to peace and must disarm. The same tyrant has tried to dominate the Middle East, has invaded and brutally occupied a small neighbor, has struck other nations without warning, and holds an unrelenting hostility toward the United States. Saddam Hussein is a homicidal dictator who is addicted to weapons of mass destruction. Hamas alone, and I think you have to really add in the word Iran. People don't want to talk about it. There can be no sympathy, no excuses, and no escape from these monsters, and we will do what has to be done.
Oh my God. So yeah, that's the great hope for America first. Donald Trump says that, Iran, no one wants to talk about it. Well, I haven't found a GOP hopeful that doesn't want to talk about Iran right now, or Hezbollah for that matter. There's just no hope for non-interventionists from the GOP side. I hate to break it to you. I was on with Dave Smith last night on Part of the Problem. And we talked about this, and it's like, he and I we were messaging each other privately, talking about man, since he's not going to run, should we just throw a hat in the ring behind RFK, Vivek, maybe some other GOP hopeful rises from the ashes and, seems like he's got a chance to win. That's truly, Thomas Massey-esque, that like wants genuine non-intervention, genuine America first, genuine America only, because that's really what I am. I'm not America first. I'm America only. I don't want aid. I don't want military. I don't want anything. Our country cannot sustain it. We have to batten down the hatches. We have to bring our troops home. We have to bring our funds home. We can't continue to just deploy them to everybody that has needs all across the world, because it's really not about their needs. It's about our control. We all know this. We all know the reason. But we're losing control. We're losing our capacity to actually be this global hegemon, because financially, just math-wise, it will not continue. So anyways, Dave and I are floating around, Vivek and RFK. He's had both of them on his show. I've had Vivek on mine. We followed their campaigns very closely. RFK, phenomenal when it comes to, at least rhetorically. Just assume that when I say phenomenal, I mean rhetorically. I have no idea what these people would do in power. They could be totally deceiving me on all fronts. But rhetorically, great on the FBI, CIA, Ukraine, non-intervention, and the COVID era. That's offering me a lot. Terrible on a bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to recap that. It doesn't really matter. Vivek, fantastic on, once again, FBI, deep state, getting rid of the bureaucracy. I'm sure he'd be in favor of cutting taxes and regulations too. I never really talked to him about that. Great on ESG, DEI, and pretty good on non-intervention. I didn't like what he had to say about the cartels in Mexico, but he was pretty good on the rest of it. And I didn't love what he had to say about Taiwan either. But, for a GOP hopeful, that's about as good as you can ask for. And then Israel had its terrorist attack. And, RFK, even before that, had already kind of, kissed the ring. And over the past couple of days, I read the tweet that Vivek put out yesterday, but it's like, what do you say? Something to the effect of like, it's a chosen land for a chosen people. And, it's just like exactly what you would expect someone who's, under the thumb of the Israel lobby to say. And it's just super disappointing. So, that's my perspective, is like, this is the reason that Libertarian Party exists, because they're really, from the federal level, left and right, there's always a war that they want, that their donors want. And really the only people that are genuinely non-interventionists are us. Like, that's it. As far as I can tell. I hope that there's more out there, particularly the America First MAGA movement. I hope many of you are watching going, no, I am with you. I do not want to send my sons and daughters to the Middle East again. I don't want to send them to Ukraine to fight Russia. I don't want any of this. Okay, I'm not talking to you, and thank you. But in terms of the candidates on offer, oof, doesn't look like we got much of a path here, folks. So.
Here's the article we're talking about. This is from Politico, and it's not just this article, it's a couple of other things we have, but they write, Speaker Johnson's Ukraine views have been, quote, evolving. And this is a cautionary tale for what happens when you get power in D.C. Go to the next clip. This is Johnson before being Speaker, from the same article. Johnson's voting record doesn't bode well for Ukraine. He received an F on the Republican for Ukraine advocacy group's report card and has argued that there is insufficient oversight. Last year, he voted against sending Kiev a $40 billion package, saying it'd be better spent on priorities at home. Pre-Speaker Johnson, no way, Jose, money for Ukraine. Now that he's Speaker, go to the next one. Asked whether he supports more assistance to Ukraine on Wednesday, he was surprisingly clear. We all do. We're going to have conditions on that, so we're working through, he said. We want accountability, and we want objectives that are clear in from the White House. So we all support it. And he went on Hannity to expound a little bit on his views on Ukraine and Russia. And they're surprisingly mainstream neocon, Dr. Paul. I'll go back one, actually. We don't need that one right now. We want to do the clip, the video clip of him on Hannity. I think we want to do you might want to grab your earpiece, Dr. Paul. Hang on just 1 second to get plugged in. Do those first 50 seconds to hear a little bit about what Mike Johnson really thinks about foreign policy.
Now, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them. We want to be cooperative. We need to work together on this, but we owe it to the people to know what the plan is, where the money's going to be spent, and we need some auditing for the dollars that we've already sent over there. These are not tough questions, right? The one thing that House Republicans are resolved on is that we must stand with our most important ally in the Middle East, and that's Israel. We certainly hope that it doesn't come to boots on the ground. If it comes to that, and we communicated this to the White House staff as well today, that we have the Article 1 power in the legislative branch of government, and we have Article 2.
Makes a good point. So Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, tells Sean Hannity, we can't allow Putin to prevail in Ukraine. U.S. boots on the ground may be required to stand with Israel. He supports Israel directly attacking Iran, and he calls Russia, China, and Iran the new axis of evil. So he is literally, Dr. Paul, a carbon copy of the Bush-era neocons. Mike Cernovich, who is a very well-known conservative Republican commentator, he tweeted this after watching this Hannity segment. And it's kind of interesting because the reason why this is interesting, I think, is, Dr. Paul, because we have to give credit to Thomas Massie, who says, you know what, McCarthy, for as bad as he is, getting rid of him may not be a good idea. Here's what Cernovich said. Republicans traded its greatest fundraiser in decades for an end-times-obsessed evangelical who believes a large Middle Eastern war is what will usher in the return of Christ. Great stuff, guys. There's Cernovich. So there are people on the right who don't like this stuff. So anyway, sorry for the long intro, but the point is that, unfortunately, as Tom Woods says, no matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain.
This is not a good sign when the new speaker seems to have blended in. The American people want change. This is not a change. It's almost like, you know, I was trying to get the definition of evolving. Maybe there's nothing evolving. Maybe you imply there's no change.
Yeah, I think it was chilling when he said, hey, you know, I communicated with the White House. If we need U.S. boots on the ground in Israel, we've got Article 1, Article 2 powers. We can sort it out. Rather than saying, listen, you better come to Congress. Let us know what your plan is. What is your end game? What's the goal? What are the resources that we need you to make this declaration? We need the authorization. No, it's, hey, don't worry. It's just like in the Bush era. Just ask us, Mr. President, wink, wink. We'll get you whatever you want.
But never did he say that we have a constitutional obligation to defend ourselves in this country. They think that. They say, if you, he killed an American over in Syria, so therefore, well, what are we doing there? And so few people ask that question. But fortunately, more people are asking the question. And we'll encourage people to keep asking the question, because the popular attitude toward pumping more money into Ukraine seems to prevail. And most Americans now don't see any good of it, even though some in there are saying, yeah, we need it for Taiwan or something else.
Well, Speaker Johnson here shows his ignorance, and it's dangerous to have someone so ignorant being so warmongerish. He's encouraging Israel to attack Iran. He literally says that in this interview with Hannity. Well, in that case, I don't think you can put aside the very strong possibility that Russia would intervene to assist its ally Iran, because if Israel successfully defeats Iran, it will take out Assad in Syria, and it will take out a Russian military base in Syria. So essentially what he is literally arguing for is World War III. Rather than saying, guys, let's back down, let's find a peaceful way out of this, there's still time for us to stop the killing, he's saying, no, we need to ramp up the killing. Come on, Israel, attack Iran. That's what we want them to do. He's literally cheering on for World War III. But attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria continue after U.S. airstrikes. So we have, as we said last week, we occupy a third of Syria. We don't, but Washington does. A third of Syria. Still have a lot of troops in Iraq. People would say, why? And they'd say, well, because they're shooting us. We have to stay there. So there's this pattern of the U.S. having a military strike on some of these bases, and then strikes from different assets in the region against U.S. military bases, which leads to more strikes on the groups and over again. So there you go. But it is ramping up. It's heating up.
You know, and sometimes I watch a lot of the business news, and sometimes you think the business people are less partisan and less into the foreign policy. But so often I hear the comments: the Americans were attacked, and an American was killed. Here we are, 7,000 miles away, putting sanctions on countries, and then all of a sudden they're attacking us. Well, how far did we have to go to make it available where they could attack it? Oh, 7,000 miles, that's all. So, but the whole concept that we have to be there, you know, it's this fanaticism that goes along with empire. It never stops. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's power, but most of the time I think it's power, because some of the people who run the show have a lot of money. And but eventually, since it's all fake, there is a liquidation and a correction, but it's so painful. That is the problem. And what gets me is it's all preventable.
Yeah.
You know, bad policy does this, and most of the time it's government behind the scenes and the people being careless and lackadaisical and not paying attention, because as long as they get their food stamps, the big guys and the little guys, more the big guys, you know, oh, as long as we get to spend money, they don't lament these setbacks. Oh, more weapons to build.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy.
I have a few thoughts as to why the people of a country like ours, once the freest and most prosperous, allowed the conditions to deteriorate to the degree that they have. Freedom, private property, and enforceable voluntary contracts generate wealth. In our early history, we were very much aware of this. But in the early part of the 20th century, our politicians promoted the notion that the tax and monetary system had to change. If we were to involve ourselves in excessive domestic and military spending, that is why Congress gave us the Federal Reserve and the income tax. The majority of Americans and many government officials agreed that sacrificing some liberty was necessary to carry out what some claim to be progressive ideas. Pure democracy became acceptable. They failed to recognize that what they were doing was exactly opposite of what the colonists were seeking when they broke away from the British. Some complain that my arguments make no sense, since great wealth and the standard of living improved for many Americans over the last 100 years, even with these new policies. But the damage to the market economy and the currency has been insidious and steady. It took a long time to consume our wealth, destroy the currency, and undermine productivity, and get our financial obligations to a point of no return. Confidence sometimes lasts longer than deserved. Most of our wealth today depends on debt. The wealth that we enjoyed and seemed to be endless allowed concern for the principle of a free society to be neglected. As long as most people believed the material abundance would last forever, worrying about protecting a competitive, productive economy and individual liberty seemed unnecessary. The age of redistribution. This neglect ushered in an age of redistribution of wealth by government, kowtowing to any and all special interests, except for those who just wanted to be left alone. That is why today, money in politics far surpasses money currently going into research and development and productive entrepreneurial efforts. The material benefits became more important than the understanding and promoting the principles of liberty and a free market. It is good that material abundance is a result of liberty, but materialism is all that we care. If materialism is all that we care about, problems are guaranteed. The crisis arrived because the illusion that wealth and prosperity would last forever has ended. Since it was based on debt and a pretense that debt can be papered over by an out-of-control fiat monetary system, it was doomed to fail. We have ended up with a system that doesn't produce enough even to finance the debt, and no fundamental understanding of why a free society is crucial to reversing these trends. If this is not recognized, the recovery will linger for a long time. Bigger government, more spending, more debt, more poverty for the middle class, and a more intense scramble by the elite special interests will continue. We need an intellectual awakening. Without an intellectual awakening, the turning point will be driven by economic law. A dollar crisis will bring the current out-of-control system to its knees. If it's not accepted that big government, fiat money, ignoring liberty, central economic planning, welfareism, and warfareism caused our crisis, we can expect a continuous and dangerous march toward corporatism and even fascism, with even more loss of our liberties. Prosperity for a large middle class, though, will become an abstract dream. This continuous move is no different than what we have seen in how our financial crisis of 2008 was handled. Congress first directed, with bipartisan support, bailouts for the wealthy. Then it was the Federal Reserve with its endless quantitative easing. If at first it doesn't succeed, try again. QE1, QE2, QE3, and with no results, we try QE indefinitely. That is, until it too fails. There is a cost to all of this, and let me assure you, delaying the payment is no longer an option. The rules of the market will extract its pound of flesh, and it won't be pretty. The current crisis elicits a lot of pessimism, and the pessimism adds to less confidence in the future. The two feed on themselves, making our situation worse. If the underlying cause of the crisis is not understood, we cannot solve our problems. The issue of warfare and welfare, deficits, inflationism and corporatism, bailouts and authoritarianism cannot be ignored. By only expanding these policies, we cannot expect good results. Everyone claims support for freedom, but too often it's for one's own freedoms and not for others. Too many believe that there must be limits on freedom. They argue that freedom must be directed and managed to achieve fairness and equality, thus making it acceptable to curtail through force certain liberties. Some decide what and whose freedoms to be limited. These are the politicians whose goal in life is power. Their success depends on gaining support from special interests. We don't need more isms. The great news is the answer is not to be found in more isms. The answers are to be found in more liberty, which costs so much less. Under these circumstances, spending goes down, wealth production goes up, and the quality of life improves. Just this recognition, especially if we move in this direction, increases optimism, which in itself is beneficial. The follow-through with sound policies are required, which must be understood and supported by the people. But there is good evidence that the generation coming of age at the present time is supportive of moving in the direction of more liberty and self-reliance. The more this change in direction and the solutions become known, the quicker will be our return to optimism. Our job, for those of us who believe that a different system than the one that we had for the last 100 years has driven us to this unsustainable crisis, is to be more convincing that there is a wonderful, uncomplicated, and moral system that provides the answers. We had a taste of it in our early history. We need not give up on the notion of advancing this cause. It worked, but we allowed our leaders to concentrate on the material abundance that freedom generates while ignoring freedom itself. Now we have neither, but the door is open out of necessity for an answer. The answer available is based on the Constitution, individual liberty, in prohibiting the use of government force to provide privileges and benefits to all special interests. After over 100 years, we face a society quite different from the one that was intended by the founders. In many ways, their efforts to protect future generations with the Constitution from this danger has failed. Skeptics at the time of the Constitution, was written in 1787, warned us of today's possible outcome. The insidious nature of the erosion of our liberties and the reassurance our great abundance gave us allowed the process to evolve into a dangerous period in which we now live.
A pro-liberty speaker. Louisiana Republican Mike Johnson has been chosen as the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, ending the 3-week drama. Representative Johnson has a reputation as a fiscal and social conservative. He has at times opposed funding the Ukraine war, suggesting he may be open to non-interventionist arguments, or at least unwilling to give the military-industrial complex a blank check. However, he also supports giving Israel whatever it needs to defeat Hamas. Speaker Johnson has suggested that another short-term continuing resolution to avoid a government shutdown may be necessary to ensure the House is not pressured into passing an omnibus spending bill at the end of the year. He has said he wants to pass individual spending bills through the House. This could help restrain spending. However, Speaker Johnson should not trade away the leverage a potential shutdown gives fiscal conservatives. A speaker who is truly committed to individual liberty and who understands the urgent need to cut government spending would be willing to shut down the government if that is what it takes to get Congress to make real spending cuts. This hypothetical pro-liberty speaker would refuse to bring any bill increasing any spending in any area to the House floor unless it offsets the spending increases with equal or greater spending cuts. A pro-liberty speaker would work to repeal unconstitutional federal programs, agencies, and departments. Instead of replacing Obamacare with Obamacare Light, a pro-liberty speaker would work to repeal all federal intervention in health care and restore patient control via tax credits and expanded health savings accounts. Instead of No Child Left Behind, a pro-liberty speaker would work to shut down the unconstitutional Department of Education. A pro-liberty speaker would form coalitions with anti-war progressives to defund all unconstitutional military operations, bring the troops home, dramatically cut spending on militarism, and forbid funding for wars not declared by Congress. There could also be a left-right populist coalition formed to end corporate welfare and all other federal regulatory and spending legislation that benefits large financial institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and other big businesses. The savings from those cuts could be used to support those dependent on government programs while Congress phases out the welfare state. Also, young people should be allowed to opt out of Social Security and Medicare in exchange for a payroll tax exemption. A pro-liberty speaker would only bring legislation to the floor of the House that protects liberty and is constitutional. A pro-liberty speaker would work to protect the entire Bill of Rights. That means no more Patriot Acts, drug wars, civil asset forfeiture, airport harassment, or government-sponsored online censorship. Instead of responding to mass shootings with thoughts, prayers, and authoritarianism, a pro-liberty speaker would work to repeal unconstitutional gun control laws that leave innocent Americans defenseless. Last, but certainly not least, a pro-liberty speaker would seek to audit and end the Federal Reserve. He should also seek to protect the people's right to use alternative currencies such as precious metals and cryptocurrency. The election of a pro-liberty Speaker of the House will not happen until the liberty movement is able to gain more influence in the political climate. This is why all of us who know the truth must continue to spread the ideas of liberty. Thanks for listening.
So a leaked document drafted by Israel's intelligence ministry proposes the ethnic cleansing of the approximately 2.3 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip as a potential solution to Israel's war against Hamas. So this document was dated October 13th. It was first published by the Hebrew language website Sika Mekomet, and the Israeli government has confirmed its authenticity. According to the Times of Israel, Israeli government officials are downplaying the document, saying that it only represents initial thoughts and that they are currently focused on the war effort and not what will become of Gaza once the war is over. So the proposed plan would involve pushing the Palestinians out of Gaza into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. They would first live in tent cities until permanent structures are built. The plan also includes a several kilometer wide zone, what they call a sterile buffer zone inside Egypt, so the Palestinians could not live on the border or could not approach the border. So this plan involves using some Egyptian territory for this buffer zone. So there's a lot of reasons why, Egypt is going to reject this, and maybe it's not realistic, but I think it goes to show what the Israelis are thinking. And this document proposes two other potential plans. One is handing Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority, which administers the West Bank. So that idea would be handed over to the PA once Hamas is defeated. Another proposal would involve Israel propping up a new Arab regime in Gaza. But the document says that these two proposals would not sufficiently deter future attacks and that the preferred option is the cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza, kicking them all out. So the authors of the document said that allowing the Palestinian Authority to administer Gaza is the most dangerous alternative because they fear that it could lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state. So that's really something, because that shows what these, this is drafted again by Israel's intelligence ministry, which is headed by a member of Netanyahu's Likud party. Again, this is their line of thinking. This is Netanyahu's, what he's been doing since he's been prime minister for a very long time. There were some years there where he was not in charge, but he's been trying to do anything he can to sabotage the idea of an independent Palestinian state. They view that as a big threat. So while Israeli government officials are downplaying the document and its existence does not necessarily mean it's a policy Israel will implement, some parts of this proposal are already being carried out. The document says that the first phase of the plan would be to evacuate the northern Gaza Strip, which Israel has already ordered. And it says to focus airstrikes on the north before a ground invasion, and now we're seeing the ground invasion. So Israeli warplanes launched strikes in Syria early on Monday, targeting military positions in the southwest Dara province. The Israeli military also reported strikes in Lebanon as the risk of Israel's Gaza war turning into a full-blown regional conflict continues to rise. So the Israeli military said the strikes in Syria were in response to rocket fire that came from Syria. And while these strikes could be related to the Gaza flare-up, I don't want to say Gaza flare-up, it's much more than a flare-up. I mean to say this flare-up between Israel and Syria is related to the Gaza war. Israel has been bombing Syria with impunity for years and years now. So it's nothing new for Israel to bomb Syria. So they can't be surprised if rockets or missiles are fired from Syria into Israel. Syria generally never responds to the constant Israeli airstrikes against them. So a Syrian military source told Syria's state news agency that the Israeli strikes caused some material damage and reported no casualties. So according to my count, and this count, I might be missing some now with everything that's going on, this airstrike marks at least the 31st time that Israel has bombed Syria this year. And the reason why I keep track of it is because, I always made a point to cover Israel's airstrikes in Syria because it gets little attention. And sometimes they bomb them very frequently, like once a week. The year's not over. We got about 2 months left and they've bombed them 31 times already. So it's a lot of bombing for 1 year. So the Israeli military said that it also hit targets in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah sites, which they said were in response to rocket fire from Lebanon. So since October 7th, Hezbollah and Israel have exchanged fire on a near daily occurrence. So I haven't really been doing the best job of keeping up with the Lebanon-Israel fire, but it's been going on, again, almost daily. So there's just a risk of things really escalating up there. And dozens of Hezbollah fighters and some civilians, including that Reuters journalist, have been killed in the skirmishes across the border. So one of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's closest aides has told Time magazine that the Ukrainian leader has deluded himself into thinking Ukraine can win an ultimate victory against Russia after the failed counteroffensive amid waning support for the conflict in the West. So this report said that despite the setbacks, Zelensky, quote, does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. This is immovable, verging on the messianic, end quote. So that's a quote from the report. And then the aide to Zelensky, which they described as one of his closest aides, said that Zelensky deludes himself and added, quote, we're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that, end quote. So this report said that the idea of negotiating peace or a temporary truce with Russia remains taboo to Zelensky.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
We are in the most dire of times I could have ever imagined, and I can't even like really wrap my head around having an ego about this stuff as much as I just want to like deliver the most important messages to the most people and pray that it's enough. You know, that's what I care about.
Dude, I the thing, I tweeted something today about how awesome Scott Horton was on Tim Pool last night, and there were a few people who responded being like, "Oh, I thought you guys were having like a weird thing," and I'm like, "Yeah, we are."
Right.
But whatever. Like, he
That's
was
not the
so
point.
awesome on Tim Pool last night. Like, I don't know. What do you want me to say? Like, I still, no matter what's going on, it's still like, yeah, but what he was saying was so right. Because I actually believe in this. Like, so yeah. I think it's important for people to go see that. I think we'd all do better to have a little bit less ego and a little bit more focus on what the actual mission is.
You got Netanyahu up there, quoting Old Testament or Talmud stuff. And it's just like this is going in a very dark place, folks. And if you're actually looking, I don't know if you saw the footage of the protests in, I'm going to still call it Turkey because I don't know when it became Turkey or whatever, but massive protests in Turkey. Obviously all in favor of the Palestinians. You've seen the same in Lebanon. I would imagine it's happening in Iran and many other nations too. So I just think that they are playing with fire on a scale that you would have to be totally blind not to see. And I think that's been what I've tried to really emphasize is that, like, even though the majority of my messaging over the past 3 weeks has come across as if I am defending the Palestinian side, more than anything, what I'm trying to convey is that this is a very complex topic that many of us don't have the backdrop to. And before you give your allegiance, your blind allegiance, much less to either side in this fight, it's very important that you understand why it transpired. Just as it's very important to understand why 9/11 happened and why they did it. It's not justification, as Ron Paul has always made very clear. It's that you have to understand the dynamics if you're going to actually prescribe any sort of remedy. And it seems as if people are just forgetting about the entire analysis phase and just going 1,400 innocents, kill everybody. That's, if you care about the existence of Israel, you better really, really reflect on who their neighbors are and what this could amount to if it gets as ugly as it looks like it might.
Just like, should we be optimistic or pessimistic? Should we believe in hope for the future, or should we accept that it's all lost anyway, so we're doomed? And I will say this. I know I've said this before, and maybe the last couple of weeks are more of a downer than other weeks have been. I can't stand the idea of even asking the question whether I should be optimistic about the future or not. And I think a lot of this is because I have kids, and when you're in that situation, you just
there's no choice.
I don't have the option to consider being black-pilled. I know you've probably heard me use this example before, but I look at it like when the question is, should you be white-pilled or black-pilled? Should you be optimistic about the future or pessimistic about the future? What I compare it to is, okay, so let's say I look at my window and there's 12 guys with guns charging my house. And in my house, I have, if the feds are listening, I have nothing in my house. But let's just say, hypothetically, I have one AR-15 in my house, whatever. And let's say one, for hypothetically speaking. And should I go, well, okay, I got my wife and my 2 little kids in my house. Should I be, and someone went, are you white-pilled or black-pilled about this situation? And I went like, I'm just feeling really black-pilled today. Like, I don't know. There's 12 of them and there's only one of me. What am I going to do? I'm probably going to lose. You're like, what the fuck are you talking about? I would never have that attitude. The attitude is like, hey, baby, you get up to the attic with the kids right here. You take the handgun. If anyone opens this door who's not me, you shoot them in the fucking face. I got 6 cans of gasoline in the shed out back. I'm going to make some makeshift bombs right now. I'm going to throw these around and start blowing them up to try to take as many people out as I can. I'm going to be at the top of the stairs sniping people out before they get, like I'm just saying, whatever it is, you fight till your last dying breath.
Exactly, dude.
Because that's the attitude. So fuck all this shit about even a question of whether you're white pilled or black pilled. Black pilled is some bitch pussy shit that you don't have the option to be. We are all white pilled, and that's that. And so what are we going to do? The attitude I would have if my wife and my kids were under direct attack would be, we are surviving this. So how do we get there?
Right.
Period.
Yep. And that, honestly,
there's no option. There's no other option.
Yeah. Am I feeling black pilled or white pilled? No, I'm feeling trigger happy.
Right.
In the hypothetical you laid out. Look,
yes.
The whole
hypothetical.
Yes.
So everyone knows.
Yeah. Just make that very crystal clear for the YouTube moderators. The people that are listening to this, like, there's just no way that you're hopeless. Like, you wouldn't be listening to this if you were hopeless. The whole reason that you're engaged in this environment is that you're interested, you're concerned, you're putting time, energy, effort into trying to analyze and hopefully remedy what ails us as a civilization. So it's just not feasible. And also, it's just not how I'm built. Like, thank God for my parents, because they have just imbued in me, kind of an irrational confidence that, like, I will always prevail if I give my all to anything. And that's not always the case. Obviously, I failed many times, but as long as you have that perspective, I think it's a much more productive way of looking at at your life. And let's be honest, I'm not very religious. All I have is this life, so I'm going to fight, dude. I'm going to fight the bitter end.
Yeah, I completely agree.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Howdy, partners. Guess you all can set a spell and join me here for a special Halloween episode of the Peter Schiff Show podcast. And I'm sure now somebody is going to excerpt me in this cowboy hat and try to make fun of me for Halloween. And I probably should take this hat off to do this podcast, because it casts a weird shadow, I noticed. And so Druckenmiller is talking with Paul Tudor Jones, and he had some very harsh words for Janet Yellen, Secretary Yellen. And he basically said that, and I'm going to read this, I just copied it. He said, if you go back to Alexander Hamilton, who was the very first Secretary of the Treasury, you know what happened to him? He ended up getting shot, right, by Aaron Burr. But he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. But anyway, and he said, it was the biggest blunder in the history of the Treasury. I have no idea why she's not called out on this, and she has no right to still be in her job. Now, what is he talking about? What is the biggest blunder in the history of the Treasury? Well, he says that Janet Yellen should have refinanced the national debt a couple of years ago when she had the chance. She said that, she was borrowing in the 2-year Treasury market at 15 basis points when she should have been borrowing for 10 years at 70 basis points, or for 30 years at 180. But she decided to keep the maturity short, and this was a gigantic blunder, and now we're going to pay for it because she had this opportunity that she squandered. Well, I think it's really unfair to single her out. Not that she doesn't deserve condemnation. She does. But if you just focus on Yellen, you let everybody else off the hook. I mentioned on my last podcast, this started with Robert Rubin. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton. He started to reduce the maturity on the national debt because it temporarily reduced the interest expense and therefore lowered the deficits, the budget deficits. And so Janet Yellen simply continued the policy that every single Secretary of the Treasury since Robert Rubin had done. So Rubin wrote the playbook, and she just followed it, right? She just did what everybody else did. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse it, right? It just makes her a good Nazi, right? She just was following orders, right? Kick the can down the road, right? Do whatever you can to keep the cost down in the short run. And it's not like, the problem started on her watch. They didn't. Nor could she have refinanced all of that debt at those low interest rates. It would have been impossible for her to have done it, even if she tried. Now, obviously, she could have gotten some of it off, but she couldn't have sold all those bonds at those low yields, because the low yields would have disappeared the minute the Fed tried to sell all those bonds. Because the reason that the yields were so low was that the Fed wasn't selling long-term debt. The Fed was borrowing short-term. The Treasury was borrowing short-term. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve was doing quantitative easing. So the Federal Reserve was buying the very bonds that Druckenmiller is criticizing Yellen for not selling. And again, not many private buyers would have been willing to loan money to the U.S. government at 70 basis points for 10 years. Only the Federal Reserve was dumb enough to buy all those bonds. And now they're losing a lot of money. In fact, Druckenmiller, tried to compare the stupidity of Yellen to how savvy the average American was, because he pointed out that every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or whatever he called them, everybody and their mother was refinancing their mortgage. Everybody was locking in these low rates except the government. Well, the reason that everybody could lock in these low rates was because the government wasn't doing it. The government was enabling the public to lock in low rates by not locking in low rates themselves. That was part of the process. But the other irony of it is, and this is something that Druckenmiller didn't even bring up, right? I mean, he's talking about the positive aspect of Americans locking in these low borrowing costs without looking at the flip side, the negative. Who owns all these bonds? Who owns all these mortgages that Tom, Dick, and Harry refinanced, at 3%? Well, Tom, Dick, and Harry's bank, the American financial system, owns all these underwater mortgages. And the entire banking system is insolvent. Well, who's got to cover that? Tom, Dick, and Harry. The average American who might have done the smart thing with his own money is stuck with the consequences of the dumb things that everybody else was doing, because we're on the hook for all these liabilities. Everybody's share of the national debt. People forget that as an American, you're not just responsible for your own debt. You're responsible for your share of the national debt. So do the math. It is a huge number. So the per capita debt is over $100,000. That's every man, woman, and child in the country, right? I mean, little babies, right? So a little baby doesn't have the capacity. You're born and you're $100,000 in debt, right? The moment the doctor slaps you, you're crying. That's what you should be crying about. Not that you got spanked, but because you're in debt $100,000 and you can't even walk yet or talk. You're already hopelessly in debt. And that's just the funded debt. That doesn't count all the unfunded liabilities, like being on the hook for all these insolvent banks when they fail. But a better way to look at what you're responsible for is not the debt per capita, but the debt per taxpayer, because the government can't get money from Americans who aren't paying taxes. So if you want to look at what your share of the debt is as a taxpayer, it's $260,000. That's what you owe as an American. Now, that's a lot more than most Americans have. So each individual American is technically insolvent if you include on his personal balance sheet his pro rata share of that national debt. But that number is going to explode. But the point I'm making is, yes, it was smart that everybody refinanced. But as a nation, we're not benefiting from that because we have both sides of that transaction. On the one hand, it's a great deal for the homeowner, but it's a lousy deal for the lender, and the homeowners are on the hook for the lender losses the way our socialist system has been put together. And, if the government had sold more 30-year bonds, somebody would own them. Who would own them? The banks, right? Pensions, insurance companies. So they would be suffering those losses. Any gain the government had they been able to, sell long-term bonds, would just be somebody else's loss who was stuck holding those bonds. The problem isn't that the debt has short-term duration. The problem is that the debt exists in the first place. That is the bigger problem. We never should have had all of this debt. The government shouldn't have spent this much money. But why did it do it? It did it because interest rates were held artificially low for all this time. And it didn't start on Janet Yellen's watch. It's been going on for a long time. That's why I've been criticizing it for a long time.
They want to split the money from Ukraine and Israel. The Biden administration wanted to combine the two for this $100 and some billion. Now, the Senate Minority Leader, McConnell, he wants them combined. And I think it's because he sees lagging support in the GOP House for Ukraine funding after, as you say, $100 and some billion with literally zero to show for it. And we'll talk about that later. Nothing to show for it. He wants the gravy train to continue. He knows who his donors are. And so he thinks combining them would do it. Now, Speaker Johnson, as you mentioned, he's in a bit of a bind because the whole reason he's in that seat is because Kevin McCarthy wanted to slip in the Ukraine money into the omnibus. And Matt Gaetz said, no way, this is not going to happen. We're going to kick you out. So they bring someone in who's just as enthusiastic. As we talked about yesterday, they said, well, do you support aid to Ukraine? We all do. So he changed his tune as soon as he gets the chair. So in a way, I kind of feel like this whole thing is a charade. This is a way to put a little bit of sugar in this nasty piece of medicine that the House GOP is going to shove down the throats of the American Republican voters. Now, put up that first link because this is what we're talking about. We'll kick it off with antiwar.com. Thanks for the great summaries. House Republicans unveil $14.3 billion bill for Israel. So they did split the two up. Yesterday, they unveiled the piece of legislation. Now it would give $14.3 billion in military aid. Of course, we know what that money is. It's very obvious. good portion of it goes to U.S. military companies. That's how the scam works. It goes to the military-industrial complex. And gets laundered back into Republican and Democrat campaigns. But the thing I wanted to ask you about is about this. So here's this. I'm not going to use the word. I'm going to see what word you're going to use. But so their big idea is, hey, we're going to send that $14.3 billion to Israel, but guess what? We're going to cut $14.3 billion out of the IRS. I don't know. What do you think about that?
You know, I find it interesting because my first thought is, boy, if you look at it very superficially, you say anything that cuts some money out of the IRS, fine. But they still end up with $50 billion. It's all a gimmick. And here they're taking money from money that is already borrowed, and so I think it gives the incentive to make the appropriations or the pretend spending very high, and it opens up the door. Because we even have taken a position, you always have to cut someplace, and I heard Johnson saying the same thing, and I think he used this as an example, but this is impure. This is not really cutting it out. This would have to involve literally, if you have a military industrial complex budget and you actually take the money out and they have less money for airplanes that don't work, and they cut back on the budget. They don't even consider that. It's always a gimmick. But the whole system is a gimmick. The system of fiat money is a gimmick, borrowing money. And the dependency on it, that I keep saying, the dependency of it depends on the authenticity and the ability of the empire to maintain its stature. And that's what's happening right now. I would think Zelensky is losing ground, but what about the Americans that have supported that? I mean, that war's over, and yet not many people. The Congress is starting to wake up because the people, how much more money are we going to pump in there? That to me is also a healthy attack on the empire that they ought to stop and call us up and ask us, well, what do you guys think we should do about foreign policy? Let me know when he calls.
Yeah, I will.
Or whoever it is going to call.
It goes a little bit more into the battle. The White House is unhappy that the GOP bill separates the money for Israel from the money for Ukraine, Taiwan, and, quote, the border. The Rules Committee is going to take up that legislation tomorrow, Wednesday. Due to the IRS cuts and lack of Ukraine funding, this Israel bill could fail to make it through the Democrat-controlled Senate. It's one of the first to be introduced under new House Speaker Mike Johnson, who vowed making supporting Israel his first priority when he was elected, and he has delivered on making a foreign country his first priority. But I'm going to say something, Dr. Paul, because we've talked about this, and we've experienced it. I think this is a charade. I think they know that they're kind of in hot water with this, spending a bunch of money with the Republican base. And so there's a little thing. We've seen these games before. What I think is going to happen is this is all for show. The House is going to put this bill in, knowing that the Senate will say, absolutely not, it's not going to work. And so when it gets to the conference committee and the two of them reconcile it, they'll come out with some sort of Hegelian compromise, the synthesis of the two, which will be the worst of both worlds. And that'll be the final vote, and the Republicans will say, well, we did try. We did introduce that bill that separated them, but at the end of the day, who's not going to step up and support our greatest allies in Europe and in the Middle East?
There's no way. The gimmick also that they use is we'll give you this money on condition that we know where it's going, but we never monitor it. We're not allowed to do it. But there was a list, and there's an effort here, and in the article of Congress headed for slowdown on Zero Hedge said that in particular, if they want to hand them, when we handed the money, we're going to hand them a list.
Yeah.
And the list is interesting because it was written by Mike Garcia, I think a very decent person, because it would be nice if we could do this. It's a hint of what we should do. It informs Biden that Congress, written by Mike Garcia, informs Biden that Congress won't authorize any additional funds for Ukraine unless, if this happens, unless the administration answers a dozen questions about the path forward. Wow. You mean to know what we're doing and whether it's a real war and when it's over and what is the goal?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're asking questions. Chief among them, how Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky plan to win the war against Russia and how long it might take. A little bit too little, too late.
Yeah.
It won't work, but at least and once again, it may be your cynical approach. This is just for the people.
Yeah.
So they're going to ask questions now before they give it out. But how many questions will they ask on the entire budget? How many questions will they ask about profiteering in the military-industrial complex where it doesn't do anything for our national defense?
Yeah.
Dependency on government largesse. Today, we face a dependency on government largesse for almost every need. Our liberties are restricted and government operates outside the rule of law, protecting and rewarding those who buy or coerce government into satisfying their demands. Here are a few examples. Undeclared wars are commonplace. Welfare for the rich and poor is considered an entitlement. The economy is overregulated, overtaxed, and grossly distorted by a deeply flawed monetary system. Debt is growing exponentially. The Patriot Act and FISA legislation passed without much debate have resulted in a steady erosion of our Fourth Amendment rights. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. The drone warfare we are pursuing worldwide is destined to end badly for us as the hatred builds, for innocent lives lost and the international laws flaunted. Once we are financially weakened and militarily challenged, there will be a lot of resentment thrown our way. It's now the law of the land that the military can arrest American citizens, hold them indefinitely without charges or a trial. Rampant hostility toward free trade is supported by a large number in Washington. Supporters of sanctions, currency manipulation, and WTO trade retaliation call the true free traders isolationists. Sanctions are used to punish countries that don't follow our orders. Bailouts and guarantees of all kinds of misbehavior are routine. Central economic planning through monetary policy, regulations, and legislative mandates has been acceptable policy. I have a few questions. Excessive government has created such a mess, it prompts many questions. Why are sick people who use medical marijuana put in prison? Why does the federal government restrict the drinking of raw milk? Why can't American manufacturers rope and other products from hemp? Why are Americans not allowed to use gold and silver as legal tender as mandated by the Constitution? Why is Germany concerned enough to consider repatriating their gold held by the Fed for her in New York? Is it that the trust in the U.S. and dollar supremacy beginning to wane? Why do our political leaders believe it's necessary to thoroughly audit? Why do our political leaders believe it's unnecessary to thoroughly audit our own gold? Why can't Americans decide which type of light bulbs they can buy? Why is it the TSA permitted to abuse the rights of any American traveling by air? Why should there be mandatory sentences, even up to life, for crimes without victims, as our drug laws require? Why have we allowed the federal government to regulate commodes in our homes? Why is it political suicide for anyone to criticize AIPAC? Why haven't we given up on the drug war, since it's an obvious failure and violates the people's rights? Has nobody noticed that the authorities can't even keep drugs out of the prisons? How can making our entire society a prison solve the problem? Why do we sacrifice so much getting necessarily involved in border disputes and civil strife around the world and ignore the root cause of the most dangerous, deadly border in the world, the one between Mexico and the United States? Why does Congress willingly give up its prerogatives to the executive branch? Why does changing the party in power never change policy? Could it be that the views of both parties are essentially the same? Why did the big banks, the large corporations, and foreign banks and foreign central banks get bailed out in 2008, and the middle class lost their jobs and their homes? Why do so many in the government and the federal officials believe that creating money out of thin air creates wealth? Why do so many accept the deeply flawed principle that government bureaucrats and politicians can protect us from ourselves without totally destroying the principle of liberty? Why can't people understand that war always destroys wealth and liberty? Why is there so little concern for the executive order that gives the president authority to establish a kill list, including American citizens, of those targeted for assassination? Why is patriotism thought to be blind loyalty to the government and the politicians who run it, rather than loyalty to the principles of liberty and support for the people? Real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong. Why is it claimed that if people won't or can't take care of their own needs, that people in government are able to do it for them? Why did we ever give the government a safe haven for initiating violence against the people? Why do so many members defend free markets but not civil liberties? Why do so many members defend civil liberties but not free markets? Aren't they the same? Why don't more defend both economic liberty and personal liberty? Why are there not more individuals who seek to intellectually influence others to bring about positive changes, those who seek changes, than those who seek power to force others to obey their commands? Why does the use of religion to support a social gospel and preemptive wars, both of which require authoritarians to use violence or the threat of violence, go unchallenged? Aggression and forced redistribution of wealth has nothing to do with the teachings of the world's great religions. Why do we allow the government and the Federal Reserve to disseminate false information dealing with both economic and foreign policy? Why is democracy held in such high esteem when it's the enemy of the minority and makes all rights relative to the dictates of the majority? Why should anyone be surprised that Congress has no credibility since there's such a disconnect between what politicians say and what they do? Is there any explanation for all the deception, the unhappiness, the fear of the future, the loss of confidence in our leaders, the distrust and the anger and frustration? Yes, there is. And there's a way to reverse these attitudes. The negative perceptions are logical and a consequence of bad policies bringing about our problems. Identification of the problems and recognizing the cause allow the proper changes to come easily. We should have more trust in ourselves, less in the government. Too many people have for far too long placed too much confidence and trust in government and not enough in themselves. Fortunately, many are now becoming aware of the seriousness of the gross mistakes of the past several decades. The blame is shared by both political parties. Many Americans now are demanding to hear the plain truth of things and want the demagoguing to stop. Without this first step, solutions are impossible. Seeking the truth and finding the answers in liberty and self-reliance promotes the optimism necessary for restoring prosperity. The task is not that difficult if politics doesn't get in the way.
Civilian casualties were an acceptable price of the bombing campaign in Gaza, and this was reported by the New York Times late on Monday. So this report said that Israeli officials referred to the U.S. and allied bombing campaigns in Germany and Japan during World War II that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. You know, we have seen Israeli officials say these things publicly as well. One official I could think of is the Israeli ambassador to the U.K., and this reference includes the U.S. bombings of Japanese cities, the fire bombings of Japanese cities, which in one night in Tokyo in 1945, it's estimated that somewhere around 100,000 civilians were killed in U.S. firebombing, burned to death. One of the most brutal ways you could kill someone. And this also includes, you know, they're also referencing the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is what they're talking about. And the reason I thought it was important to highlight this is because this shows that the U.S. knows, and as we're seeing it play out in Gaza, these massive civilian casualties, and we see U.S. officials shrugging it off, claiming that they're trying to do something, but you know, it just goes to show that they know what they're supporting, and it hasn't stopped that support. So Israel's plans for mass slaughter in Gaza and the growing child death toll have not impacted U.S. support. This Times report focused on how the Biden administration is paying lip service to the idea of limiting civilian casualties, but it also acknowledged that they're not telling Israel what to do. They're only asking questions. So if you look at the New York Times report, it's actually saying that, the U.S. has changed its messaging on Gaza. They're saying that they want a limit to civilian casualties, but it also says that they're not actually telling Israel to do anything. And right now, according to Gaza's health ministry, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 8,500 Palestinians, which includes over 3,500 children. So a military spokesman for Yemen's Houthis, who govern most of North Yemen, said Tuesday that they launched missiles and drones at Israel and warned the attacks would continue until Israel ends its war in Gaza. So Israel said that it activated its Arrow air defense system for the first time during its Gaza war to intercept a missile fired from the Red Sea. Israeli fighter jets also downed 2 hostile targets flying over the Red Sea that were believed to be drones. The Israeli military said they were intercepted and that there was no intrusion into Israeli territory. So Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sari, he said the operation was the third targeting Israel and warned that more attacks would come until the Israeli aggression stops. So he's saying it's the third time they launched missiles or drones at Israel. We know earlier this month, the Pentagon said that they intercepted, that a U.S. warship in the Red Sea intercepted missiles and drones fired by the Houthis. I didn't see the Houthis claim the attack at the time, but this appears to be confirmation. And these Houthi attacks and threats to launch more attacks are another sign that Israel's war in Gaza could explode into a major regional conflict. The U.S. has deployed an enormous amount of firepower to the region in the name of deterring other actors from entering the war. And this raises questions about a potential U.S. response to the Houthi attacks. Is that something that could happen? I think that's a legitimate question. Biden administration officials are arguing that the U.S. needs to fund the wars in Ukraine and Gaza to send a message to China in their pitch for Congress to authorize a massive $105 billion spending package that includes military aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said at a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing on Tuesday, quote, "What happens in Ukraine, what happens in the Middle East, also matters for the Indo-Pacific. Beyond Europe, we know that our allies, as well as our adversaries, as well as our competitors, are watching that conflict. They're watching our response. So this funding request is vital to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific in the face of mounting challenges in that region," end quote. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made the same argument at the hearing. He said, quote, China would like to see the United States be unsuccessful. They would like to see Russia continue to challenge us and keep us focused on that area so we have less time, energy, and resources, end quote. So it's kind of strange because he's saying that China would like the U.S. to keep spending on the war in Ukraine in an argument to say, give us more money to spend on the war in Ukraine. It's strange. And not that I agree with them, but I know there are some China hawks who argue that the U.S. should be more focused on, Taiwan. So they should scale back what they're doing in Ukraine to focus on that, which makes more sense than trying to do it all. I don't think the U.S. should do any of this, of course, but if you're going to be strategic about it, I feel like there's just a much smarter way to go about everything. But this seems more like imperial hubris from the Biden administration trying to fund all these conflicts. The civilian leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization condemned the Hamas attack on Israel, but emphasized that support for Tel Aviv must not encroach on aid for Ukraine. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg went on to warn Iran and Hezbollah against attacking Israel as Tel Aviv relentlessly bombs Gaza. So speaking at the Nordic Council in Oslo, Stoltenberg expressed that military support was the only way to achieve peace. And this is something you repeatedly hear him say, is that we need weapons for peace. He said, quote, a new winter is approaching and we must expect new attacks against energy supplies and other critical infrastructure. There are no signs that Russia is planning for peace. On the contrary, they are planning for more war. Therefore, we must continue to support Ukraine. That means more weapons. And I say that because I want peace in Ukraine, end quote. Sure. And the quote that he said about Gaza was that the war, quote, must not lead to a weakening of our will and ability to support Ukraine, end quote.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
Go to CNN and look at one of their major stories. Matthew Perry's former fiance pays tribute to the late actor. What the fuck do I care? I don't even know who the fucking guy is. What the fuck do I care? Put this in People's Magazine, but I'm mentioning this is because this is what the mainstream media has become. Total fucking bullshit scum shoving down your throat. And to get this clear, we're giving you in the Trends Journal what nobody else in the world is giving you in a magazine. Oh, let's go to the economy now. Oh, hey, the markets, they went up today and yesterday. Yeah, but the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are in correction territory. How come? Oh, because when you go back to July, we had forecast exactly what would happen. And it's happening now. The markets went down in September and October. The clip is there for everyone to listen to. New York Times yesterday, actually Sunday, Netanyahu ignored warnings from security services that they were fueling dangerous political turmoil. And they warned them of an attack. They knew it was coming. When all else fails, they take you to war. This is the Netanyahu who said yesterday, Israel would not agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, and quoted the Bible that this is a time for war, end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war. So go back to your cover of your Trends Journal. Politicians, fuck peace. War is the only solution. All right? Fuck you, Netanyahu. My God does not believe there is a time for peace and a time for war. So I would say to you, shove your Bible up your ass. And your ass is probably wide enough to shove a Bible up it, because all that ever comes out of you is a load of shit. And you're no different than the rest of the politicians. Is Representative Mike Johnson, a little fucking boy of nothing. A little clown, another Johnson, like Lyndon Baines Johnson, a little fucking warmongering prick that died with one of the richest guys in Congress from a nobody. Oh, that another Johnson? Yeah. He said that Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran are a trilateral threat to Washington. No, they're not. Big priorities in this moment right now. We have Israel being attacked. No, Israel's now killing everybody, not being attacked. We have unrest, because the fucking country's going down the crapper because of scumbags like you and the other repulsive kids and Democrats, murderers and thieves, a crime syndicate that people call Congress and the White House. We have Ukrainian situation we've got to deal with. No, we don't have to fucking deal with it. Hey, scumbag, we got to go deal with it? Go over there and deal with it, all right? Or shut your little mouth. We have China being aggressive. Yeah, like the United States isn't. We have Iran with all meddling. Oh, the United States doesn't meddle anywhere. It goes on and on and on. Oh, and the guy, this is the best part. He calls himself a Christian. Yeah? Not the Christ that I believe in, Junior. I'm a warrior for the Prince of Peace. Prince of Peace. So the Christ that you believe in, save your shit for yourself. Save your shit for yourself. Christ does not approve what's going on in the world. Not my Christ. Peace or die in war. What side are you on? Evangelical. Poof. Bullshit, Jellicle. So again, the markets went up today. The markets are going to crash as we see it. The Fed's going to meet tomorrow, and they're not going to raise interest rates. And we forecast they're going to radically lower them coming up into the presidential reality show next year because the fucking Fed is running the country. You got to be fucking stupid and ignorant not to see it. Our Treasury Secretary is Ms. Facha Brut, Janet Yellen, the former Fed head. So they want to keep the former Fed head in control of our Treasury. Got it? The banksters are in control of our lives. And it's the bankster bandits that love war because, hey, they're war hordes.
Deterioration of nuclear arms treaties, especially within the context of the war in Ukraine, presents worrying trends not seen in generations as Washington and Moscow are one step away from direct conflict. The doomsday clock now stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to global catastrophe it's ever been, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's a shame we've even got a doomsday clock. Could we set it back for summertime? Don't move that thing forward! We've only got 90 seconds! But the farmers! The Russian Duma has advanced plans to withdraw ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, citing the need to restore parity with the US, which has yet to ratify the decades-old treaty. While the decision to withdraw ratification will not be as damaging as America's unilateral withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2002 and 2019 respectively, it serves as another reminder that attention must be directed towards addressing an increased nuclear threat, especially as war rages in Ukraine. The US must lead by example, like ratifying the CTBT when it comes to international treaties it expects other countries to abide by. I'd like you to abide by this treaty. Will you be abiding by this treaty? That's your treaty. Keep that treaty away from me. And why don't you sign that treaty, you warmonger? Unsurprisingly, following Russian President Vladimir Putin's comments on the subject earlier this month at the Valdai International Discussion Club, bit relaxed. Ah, welcome, sit down. Let's have a discussion. Would you like to die in a nuclear war? No, I'd prefer to live peacefully in a kind of democracy. Vetoed! The legislative process for de-ratification began at pace. That's what they're doing at the old discussion club. And now, let's not ratify any peace treaties. I love this discussion club. More wine? Yes, please. Tastes a bit radioactive. Small price to pay. Down the hatch? Actually, we should get down the hatch because... oh yes, bloody hell, another mushroom cloud. Officials have clarified that at present, Moscow does not see a need to resume nuclear tests, even if Russia were to withdraw. The CTBT, adopted in 1996 by the United Nations General Assembly and ratified by 174 countries, prohibits nuclear weapons tests or explosions anywhere in the world. Reasonable. The treaty has never officially entered into force, as several states have not signed or completed the process of ratification. Let's see which ones, and whether this list includes the people that you'd really, really want to sign that treaty. Here goes. Haven't read it yet. China? I'd like them to sign it. India? Yes, please. Especially because the next one is Pakistan. Egypt? Oh, would you? Iran? Oh, God. North Korea? Oh, it's getting worse. Israel? And finally, the United States. Do you notice that all the people that ain't signed it are the people that you most want to sign it, who are most likely to be involved in a nuclear conflict? What a coincidence. Nevertheless, the CTBT is one of the most successful agreements in a long history of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. Well, watch this space. Without the option to conduct nuclear tests, it is more difficult, although not impossible, for states to develop, prove and field new warhead designs, notes Darrell G. Kimball, Kimball, executive director of the Arms Control Association. In part due to Russia's war in Ukraine, Moscow has increased reliance on its nuclear arsenal in an attempt to deter escalations as its conventional forces have encountered stiff resistance by Ukrainian fighters heavily backed by American and European financial and military support. Indeed, there have been several warnings and even threats from the Kremlin and the Russian security establishment, some more subtle than others, about Moscow's willingness to defend what it views as its existential interest in Ukraine, ultimately with nuclear force if necessary. So, still climate change? I mean, remember that news broadcast, what's going to kill you first? I mean, is this where we are now? What do you want to die of? Choose your poison? It looks like Vladimir Putin does have nuclear weapons and has said he will use nuclear weapons and has shown that he will respond to red lines being crossed by increasing military activity, and we are continuing to increase military activity. So I don't know which one's going to kill you first, but I won't bother recycling. Not to be outdone by their Russian colleagues, commentators in the US and Europe appear comfortable calling Moscow's bluff and encouraging an array of options for the intensification of the conflict. While American and European commentators have proven right thus far and no nuclear escalation has occurred, the greatest tragedy is that the day after they are proven wrong, there will be nobody left to tell. Yes, that's the nature of Armageddon. We believe there will not be a Wait a minute. Nope, we still... Wait a minute. We don't think we are 100, 90%, 50%. Actually, I'm going to go into the basement for a couple of months. Bye! Following the near-apocalyptic episode remembered as the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders from the US and the Soviet Union sought to establish mechanisms to prevent once again from being on the doorstep of nuclear annihilation. Yeah, it's not a good doorstep. Ding dong! Oh, they're not in. These began in 1963 with the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan jointly stated that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. Sensible. Those were the glory days, weren't they, of Gorbachev and Reagan? We've come a long way, baby. We must have nuclear wars. Yes, we must. Ah, progress. Is this what progress means, Daddy? It is, son. It is, son. Now go get yourself a job at Burisma. You're overqualified, if anything. Take this gas mask. The two leaders eventually went on to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which represented the first time the US and USSR agreed to reduce the actual number of nuclear arms. As strategic stability between the two most heavily equipped nuclear states on Earth continues to deteriorate and the deplorable state of diplomatic relations does not bode well for the return of nuclear treaties, China, Britain and others are seeking to modernise and enhance their nuclear capabilities. It's also possible that more states may resort to developing their own nuclear arsenals, viewing the possession of such weapons as the only real means of self-defence in an increasingly disorderly world. There's another facet of the apocalypse we've not considered. Have you not seen the upside? What about those guys over in nuclear weapons manufacture? It's a boon for them and a boom for us. For its part, the US is in the process of a $2 trillion, 3 decades long initiative to upgrade its nuclear triad and accompanying infrastructure. A recently published report by the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States paints an alarmist picture of the strategic threat the US faces in the world today and offers recommendations that will likely produce, fingers crossed, further instability. As the Quincy Institute's Bill Hartung recently wrote, astoundingly, the Commission argues that these investments are not enough and that the US should consider building and deploying more nuclear weapons, even as it endorses dangerous and destabilizing steps like returning to the days of multi-warhead land-based missiles while placing nuclear-armed missiles in East Asia. These steps would only introduce more uncertainty into the calculations of China and Russia, making a nuclear confrontation more likely. So it's not just in your imagination, things are actually getting worse. Fuel prices are increasing, food prices are increasing, health is getting worse, children are becoming more obese, peculiar pandemics, strange policies and outcomes, and treaties that protected our future are being torn up, and nations across the world are increasing their nuclear weapons arsenal.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
We've got the new Speaker of the House, and this was an article from NBC. In his first act, Speaker Mike Johnson uses Israel aid to pick a fight with Joe Biden. All right, so let's read a little bit of the fight that he's picking with Joe Biden. And so here we go. I got to pull up this full screen. I understand that the priority is to bulk up the IRS, but I think if you put this to the American people and they weigh the two needs, I think they're going to stand with Israel and protecting the innocent. Over there is our national interest and is more immediate than the IRS agents, Johnson told Fox News. The White House pushed back, accusing Republicans of trying to help the wealthy and big corporations cheat on their taxes with a proposal that would grow the deficit. And by the way, just talk about being an excellent son of a bitch lawyer, because the best sons of bitches are the ones that just do it with a smile. They seem calm. They seem like nice people, and they turn around and they just go, oh, hey, pal, I got this leverage on you. Hey, listen, I'm trying to help you out, but I just want you to know that I've got this information on you. And so if you don't kind of do what I want to do just to help you out here, And so here, this guy's figured out the one way that even I will go, yes, just send all the money over to Israel, which is if we don't send it to Israel, we're getting more IRS agents. Listen, it's one or the other. This money's been dedicated to government, and either we can use it to hire more IRS agents that are going to come after you and, make it that you have to spend more money so that we actually do have enough money to go to Israel, or we can just send it directly there, in which case, we can avoid the whole IRS needing to shake you down problem. There you go. Well, talk about a good son of a bitch lawyer over there, who figured out how to play the one card that even I'm like, yeah, send it over there. All right, wait. I think I had another piece on that. Politicizing our national security interest is a non-starter, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said in a statement, demanding offsets for meeting core national security needs of the United States, like supporting Israel and defending Ukraine from atrocities and Russian imperialism, would be a break with the normal. All right, I guess that was all I had on that. Security officials constantly spoke of the need to strengthen the more moderate Palestinian Authority, strengthen them at the expense of Hamas, said Yohan Plesner, a president of the Israel Democracy Institute, a Jerusalem-based think tank. But he said Netanyahu saw it as quite a desirable outcome to have two separate political entities representing the Palestinian people. In public statements, Netanyahu has said the Palestinian Authority, led by President Mahmoud Abbas, can't be a partner for peace because while it recognizes Israel, it doesn't recognize Israel as a home for the Jewish people and hasn't engaged constructively in peace negotiations. Palestinian leadership says Netanyahu adds conditions aimed at obstructing peace negotiations. Starting in 2019, Netanyahu appeared more focused on repeated rounds of elections and tackling Hamas. No Israeli political party could get enough votes to dominate parliament, leading to a years-long stalemate. Okay. Enough of that. I do want to play this one video from the Jordan King. I didn't even know Jordan had a king. I don't know anything about this guy. Oh, it's not going to play anyways. He was basically just speaking out against collective punishment, and that anytime that you have collective punishment or the targeting of civilians, that is a war crime and everyone should be against it. Which brings me to this recent incident that took place in, I believe, Dagestan, where a pro-Palestinian mob, this is from the New York Post, forced flight from Israel to Russia to be diverted, and target next airport were landed too. And so I've been of the approach that Israel acting like I've even put it in their terms. We live in a new world with social media. I don't think they're going to be able to hold people from seeing this. Like 2 years ago, how often were we hearing about Gaza? You'd have to be listening to a Scott Horton show to hear about how it's an open air prison. There wasn't much coverage of it. I know the internet. I kind of know media. And I'm like, I'm watching what you guys are doing. You're clearly being aggressive. You're clearly blowing up buildings. There's clearly civilian casualties. I don't think you're going to keep a wraps on the story. And not only do I not think you're going to keep a wraps on the story, I don't think it's a convincing thing of, hey, we told these people that you're human shields and now we have a right to kill them. I don't buy that as a very convincing argument. And I look at this and I go, I think this will lead to anti-Semitism. And then, of course, they go the other way with it and they go, they make one of two claims. One is that it's that people are anti-Semitic, and this is the exact reason why we need Israel and Israel to be so aggressive, which totally just kind of skirts the idea that people might be anti-Israel or become anti-Semitic because of the actions being actually taking place, which are aggressive, in my opinion. And so the flip side of it is that they try and take a racist stance, which is like, no, I guess Muslims are a natural enemy. We've just allowed them into all these countries. They're pretending to be peaceful and just wait till they have power. And so Israel's on the front lines. But how is that a livable approach to life? And maybe when I say how is that a livable, you go, well, you're not contending with reality. I don't see any proof of it. And I don't see how through a modern lens that's not some element of racism or genocide. And I in my personal life, I've never dealt with a Muslim who wasn't a nice person. I've never had an issue, not once. And so I look at this and the aggressiveness and I go, guys, I don't think the optics on this look good for you. I don't think it's a win for Israel. I don't think it's a win for Jews in general.
And that's how Mike puts it. It takes a lot of money to run the biggest government in the history of the world. The federal government ran a $1.695 trillion budget deficit. We're closing on $2 trillion in the hole for fiscal 2023. This was the third largest deficit in U.S. history. And he goes on. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the national debt blew past $33 trillion on September 15th. Just 20 days later, this should hopefully, I know the numbers are so incredibly astronomical that it's hard to really wrap your head around how much this really is, but it is so ruinous. Whether it's going to completely destroy us today or somewhere down the line, I cannot tell you, but it is incredibly ruinous. 20 days later, it pushed about $33.5 trillion. In other words, the government added $500 billion to the debt in just 20 days. Here's how Peter Schiff put it in a recent podcast. Nobody understands that this crisis has started. So whether or not we look at the broader definition of how I'm looking at an economic crisis, a crisis of spending too much, a crisis of too much government power, a crisis of attacking your liberty in order to fund all this stuff, whether it's through stealing through the IRS or it's through, well, the inflation tax, destroying your purchasing power by just printing stuff out of thin air. But if we're looking at the more traditional and more modern sense of what an economic crisis is, whether it's going to be a soft landing, a hard landing, or a lot of people are going to lose their jobs and their homes, Schiff puts it this way: nobody understands that this crisis has started. But believe me, it has. This was the way the 2008 financial crisis started. It didn't just happen when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Of course, that was the outgrowth of it. The crisis led to those things. And of course, a lot of people point to just the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers as if it's just some bad company doing something and then government has to come in and protect us from that. The people who really are interested in keeping the population on its knees, this is one of the best ways to do it. High public deficits mean lower growth, lower wages, more debt, all of it leads to higher taxes and persistent inflation, another tax, maybe the most insidious one. And again, there is no free government money. You wanted a stimulus check? You have high inflation and negative real wage growth. If the U.S. does not eliminate the deficit, it will put the U.S. dollar at risk. And once you get to that, then you get into a situation of foreign policy issues as well. Here's how James Madison put it. I cite this all the time. April 20th, 1795. Again, that will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But James Madison told us that armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. So we've got the largest military empire on earth. We've got probably the largest domestic standing army, de facto standing army of militarized federal agencies. We're not going just with the IRS, but there's a massive kind of militarized federal police apparatus. And then, of course, the local police that participate in that as well. But that's another story. Tons of armies. We have tons of debts. If you're thinking about, borrowing almost $800 billion in just a quarter, talking about another trillion added on, 500 billion in just 20 days. All of this stuff is massive debts. And we already have a lot of taxes. Even if they don't point to the direct money that they're stealing from you, whether you voluntarily go along or not, is under threat of force. I can't imagine too many people looking at the U.S. central government as a charity as if they were told, hey, we're not going to do any enforcement, that all kinds of people are just going to give them as much money as they want. This is under threat of enforcement, is under threat of violence against you at all times. And we've got tons of armies, tons of debts, tons of taxes. Of course, Janet wants to give us even more because it's not enough enforcement. The big problem we have is that there's not enough tax collection. That's really the issue that we have. It's always not enough tax collection for these people. Anyways, we've got a trifecta there. And here's how Mike Maharrey put it somewhere. If I can figure out where I put this, I have no idea. Oh, here's how he put it. The national debt has been growing for so long that most people just shrug when we talk about it. They don't care. Nobody seems particularly concerned outside a handful of contrarians. Maybe us, maybe you, maybe me. But he says the most likely scenario is that spending will continue to climb along with the budget deficits. There's no telling how high these annual deficits could run. It's a fiscal powder keg. All it needs is a match. So some people think, no big deal. We can't worry about this. Maybe it's because it's so massive or because, well, government-run schooling told them, don't worry about this stuff. But Mike puts it this way. Sure, most everybody recognizes that this might be a problem down the road, but they believe that the road is long, so we can get away with continuing to kick the can. But mark my words, eventually they will run out of road. But Thomas Jefferson in 1792 wrote, talking about his views versus Alexander Hamilton's. And he says, this exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature. So if you think about what Janet was having to say, we need more power in the IRS. We need more enforcement by the IRS. We need more tools to create better voluntary compliance, which is not really voluntary compliance for the IRS. She's basically saying, well, we've got all this deficit. We're going to keep the spending, but this will manipulate the legislature maybe into spending more money on the IRS. This is exactly how it's playing out. We've had the Hamiltonian approach ever since, unfortunately. And it is absolutely destroying our liberty, giving us the largest government in history. Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right. I think no one sums this up better than Lysander Spooner right at the very, very end of No Treason number 6. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes. You should read it in full. And Spooner put it this way. The lesson taught by all these facts is this. As long as mankind continue to pay national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection.
Well, let's put up that first clip. Now, that was simultaneously published in The Guardian. I just grabbed the Guardian one, but it's originally from Responsible Statecraft. Their title is Hamas has created additional demand. Wall Street eyes big profits from war. And as you point out, Dr. Paul, we've talked about this on the Ukraine war, and now they're rubbing their hands at the prospect of another $106 billion to be spent for financing of Ukraine and the war in Gaza and Israel. The subtitle, Morgan Stanley and TD Bank hope for aerospace and weapons boon after a 7% value increase from the start of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Now go to that next one. This is the opening of the article. The UN has warned that there was clear evidence that war crimes may have been committed in the explosion of violence in Israel and Gaza. Meanwhile, Wall Street is hoping for an explosion in profits, and that's what we're seeing. Go to the next one really quick. The money could be a boon, and this is the $106 billion. The money could be a boon to the aerospace and weapons sector, which enjoyed a 7% jump in value in the immediate aftermath of Hamas's 7 October attack. Everyone was sad, furious, disgusted with the attack and with what happened and with the response. A lot of the world is. But there's one sector out there that's not as disgusted because they see the huge profit in it.
I think the word "could" is weak.
Yeah.
I think the word is "will."
Yeah.
It happens that way, and that's the way it's been going on. Matter of fact, it's a tremendous political advantage that they get because that's how they do neutralize everybody in geography and everybody. So everybody gets a piece of the action, but then you end up with Democrats, participating in it with Republicans. They bring it together. Yeah, we'd like to bring people together to do positive things, but this is not a support for peace and prosperity or the Constitution or a bit of morality about when you start wars and all. This is just pure political business, and but we're seeing the cracks.
Yeah.
And the cracks are expected because the one reason why I think the cracks in these coalitions and this continuation has to do with the limitation of wealth. And wealth is destroyed with the type of monetary system we have, and you can't create wealth, out of thin air just by the duplication of monetary units. And we're still doing it because there's an illusion and there's a trust in the system that you can get very wealthy. And I have to admit, these companies that witness this and get excited about, the amount of money just now going to be appropriated, but there's a fight going on in the Congress still.
Yeah,
so that's the crack that is occurring, and we hope to make that crack a little bit broader. Here's another sentence. I think they could strengthen it, but they're making the point here. It says, the comments are seemingly in contradiction to each company's statement on human rights.
Oh.
Everybody has to be for human rights, except the ones they want to kill, And explicit endorsements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. And I get to thinking, they'll say anything to pull the wool over the eyes of the people who are paying the bills. And of course, I'd like to think that we're in the business of trying to wake people up. And I think to some degree we reach a few now and then because they will be awakened someday when the whole thing goes bust. But the big problem then is, what are they going to replace it with? And that's why I think these technicalities ought to be worked out. Profiteering with war is it's a pretty bad thing to do, and that's been going on for a long time. It used to be just the grabbing up land. It's still the grabbing up land. That's sort of what's going on in the Middle East right now. It's as much about land as anything else.
Yeah.
Where do we have a place to live? And then that is so artificial and put together, by not so much voluntarism of two groups, but by international groups like the United Nations and the various military operations that have existed for 100 years that has created so many of the problems we're facing today.
Yeah. Cauldron of hatred and resentment toward the U.S. Here is the brilliant idea of the Biden people. This is from Bloomberg. Put this on. This is a cauldron of resentment. And here's what they say. U.S. and Israel weigh peacekeepers for the Gaza Strip after Hamas. This is Bloomberg. The U.S. and Israel are exploring options for the future of the Gaza Strip, including the possibility of a multinational force that may involve American troops. Putting troops right there in the middle of this.
Not a good idea to say the least, and it's happened a lot over history, especially in the 20th century, that we've had so many peacekeeping movements made, and it shouldn't be that you shouldn't look at this. But right now, I mentioned the other day that the leaders of both the factions that we're dealing with, they were totally 100% right they're at the point right now that we reject even talking about it or thinking about a ceasefire or negotiation. So they're locked in until they run out of foot soldiers and money. That they are going to continue to just fight the war. We've already mentioned how Zelensky is running out of steam and running out of money and running out of friends, and so something will happen there. The Middle East just got started in a way, currently started, which means that the military-industrial complex will not run out of work.
Yeah. Well, here's Blinken in that same article, and here's his rationale for putting American troops. He says, "We can't have a reversion to the status quo with Hamas running Gaza." Blinken said, who's traveling to Israel on Friday, he told the Senate Appropriations Committee, "We can't have Hamas running it. We also can't have the Israelis start," he said again, "we also can't have," and the Israelis start with this proposition themselves, is Israel running or controlling Gaza. So we can't have Hamas because of the bad guys. We can't have Israel running it because it's going to be way too dangerous for them. So I got a brilliant idea. Let's put a bunch of Americans in the middle of it so they'll be the ones to be shot at and killed.
Because we're so neutral and willing to look at both sides of the issue. And the one issue they're looking at is what's it going to do for jobs and money and profits, you know, which is so sad. There was a time in my life that I absolutely refused to believe that governments could be as evil as they have been, that they would deliberately start war. And we have participated in that. And that to me is so difficult because we have so many great things in our country. We have a great history, but it's sort of sad and it's very damaging, the fact that we have drifted so far from the intent of what the founders wanted. And to me, in looking at this history, I think the founders were rather remarkable, and they looked, but they also warned us, if you don't have a moral society, it won't work. Yeah. And I guess we're there.
We're there.
We have allowed ourselves to get into such a mess for various reasons. Politicians deceive themselves as to how wealth is produced. Excessive confidence is placed in the judgment of politicians and bureaucrats. This replaces the confidence in a free society. Too many in high places of authority became convinced that only they, armed with arbitrary government power, can bring about fairness while facilitating wealth production. This always proves to be a utopian dream and destroys wealth and liberty. It impoverishes the people and rewards the special interests who end up controlling both parties. It's no surprise that much of what goes on in Washington is driven by aggressive partisanship and power seeking, with philosophic differences being minor. Economic ignorance is commonplace. Keynesianism continues to thrive, although today it is facing healthy, enthusiastic rebuttals. Believers in military Keynesianism and domestic Keynesianism continue to desperately promote their failed policy as the economy languishes in a deep slumber. Supporters of all government edicts use humanitarian arguments to justify them. Humanitarian arguments are always used to justify government mandates related to the economy, monetary policy, foreign policy, and personal liberty. This is on purpose to make it more difficult to challenge. But initiating violence for humanitarian reasons is still violence. Good intentions are no excuse and are just as harmful as when the people use and force with bad intentions. The results are always negative. The immoral use of force is the source of man's political problems. Sadly, many religious groups, secular organizations, and psychopathic authoritarians endorse government-initiated force to change the world, even when the desired goals are well-intentioned, or especially when they're well-intentioned. The results are dismal. The good results sought never materialize. The new problems created require even more government force as a solution. The net result is institutionalizing government-initiated violence and morally justifying it on humanitarian grounds. This is the same fundamental reason our government uses force for invading other countries at will, central economic planning at home, and the regulation of personal liberty and habits of our citizens. It is rather strange that unless one has a criminal mind and no respect for other people and their property, no one claims it's permissible to go into one's neighbor's house and tell them how to behave, what they can eat, smoke, and drink, or how to spend their money. Yet, rarely is it asked why is it morally acceptable that a stranger with a badge and a gun can do the same thing in the name of law and order. Any resistance is met with brute force, fines, taxes, arrests, and even imprisonment. This is done more frequently every day without a search warrant. No government monopoly over initiating violence is what we need. Restraining aggressive behavior is one thing, but legalizing a government monopoly for initiating aggression can only lead to exhausting liberty associated with chaos, anger, and a breakdown of civil society. Permitting such authority and expecting a saintly behavior from the bureaucrats and the politicians is a pipe dream. We now have a standing army of armed bureaucrats in the TSA, CIA, FBI, Fish and Wildlife, FEMA, IRS, Corps of Engineers, etc., numbering over 100,000. Citizens are guilty until proven innocent in the unconstitutional administrative courts. Government in a free society should have no authority to meddle in the social activities or the economic transactions of individuals, nor should government meddle in the affairs of other nations. All things peaceful, even when controversial, should be permitted. We must reject the notion of prior restraint in economic activity, just as we do in the area of free speech and religious liberty. But even in these areas, government is starting to use a backdoor approach of political correctness to regulate speech, a very dangerous trend. Since 9/11, monitoring speech on the internet is now a problem since warrants are no longer required. The proliferation of federal crimes. The Constitution established 4 federal crimes. Today, the experts can't even agree on how many federal crimes are now on the books. They number into the thousands. No one person can comprehend the enormity of the legal system, especially the tax code. Due to the ill-advised drug wars and the endless federal expansion of the criminal code, we have over 6 million people under correctional suspension, more than the Soviets ever had and more than any other nation today, including China. I don't understand the complacency of the Congress and the willingness to continue their obsession with passing more federal laws. Mandatory sentencing laws associated with drug laws have compounded our prison problems. The Federal Register is now 75,000 pages long, and the tax code 72,000 pages, and expands every year. When will the people start shouting, enough is enough, and demand Congress to cease and desist? What we should be doing is achieving liberty. Liberty can only be achieved when government is denied the aggressive use of force. If one seeks liberty, a precise type of government is needed. To achieve it, more than lip service is required. There are 2 choices available. 1, a government designed to protect liberty is a natural right as its sole objective. The people are expected to care for themselves and reject the use of any force for interfering with another person's liberty. Government is given a strictly limited authority to enforce contracts, property ownerships, settles disputes, and defend against foreign aggression. Number 2, a government that pretends to protect liberty but is granted power to arbitrarily use force over the people and foreign nations. Though the grant of power many times is meant to be small and limited, it inevitably metastasizes into an omnipotent political cancer. This is the problem for which the world has suffered throughout the ages. Though meant to be limited, it nevertheless is a 100% sacrifice of the principle that would-be tyrants find irresistible. It is used vigorously, though incrementally and insidiously. Granting power to government officials always proves the adage that power corrupts. Once government gets a limited concession for the use of force to mold people's habits and plan the economy, it causes a steady erosion and a steady move toward tyrannical government. Only a revolutionary spirit can reverse the process and deny the government this arbitrary use of aggression. There is no in-between. Sacrificing a little liberty for imaginary safety always ends badly. Today's mess is a result of Americans accepting option number 2, even though the founders attempted to give us option number 1. The results are not good. As our liberties have been eroded, our wealth has been consumed. The wealth we see today is based on debt and a foolish willingness on the part of foreigners to take our dollars for goods and services. Then they loan them back to us to perpetuate our debt system. It's amazing that it has worked for this long, but the impasse in Washington in solving our problems indicate that many are starting to understand the seriousness of this worldwide debt crisis and the dangers we face. The longer this process continues, the harsher the outcome will be. The financial crisis is actually a moral crisis. Many are acknowledging that a financial crisis looms, but few understand it's in reality a moral crisis. It's the moral crisis that has allowed our liberties to be undermined and permits the exponential growth of illegal government power. Without a clear understanding of the nature of the crisis, it will be difficult to prevent a steady march toward tyranny and the poverty that will accompany it. Ultimately, the people have to decide which form of government they want. Option number 1 or option number 2. There is no other choice. Claiming there is a choice of a little tyranny is like describing pregnancy as a touch of pregnancy. It is a myth to believe that a mixture of free markets and government central economic planning is a worthy compromise. What we see today is a result of that type of thinking, and the results speak for themselves.
Senator Lindsey Graham says there is no limit on Israel killing civilians. So Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said on Tuesday that there should be no limit on how many civilian casualties Israel incurs in its bombardment of Gaza. So Graham made these comments while appearing on CNN after Israel bombed the Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza, killing dozens of people. An Israeli military commander was asked after the strike if Israel was aware that the camp was full of innocent civilians and did not deny anything, just said, basically, this is the cost of war. This is the tragedy of war. So Graham was asked about this when he was on CNN, and he was asked if there is a threshold where the U.S. might ask Israel to hold off on causing so many civilian casualties. And Graham invoked World War II and said, quote, "No, if somebody asked us after World War II, is there a limit? What would you do to make sure that Japan and Germany didn't conquer the world? Is there any limit what Israel should do to the people who are trying to slaughter the Jews? The answer is no. There is no limit," end quote. So no limit. Doesn't matter that they're killing all these kids and babies. Just doesn't matter to Graham. Clearly does not matter to the Biden administration as well. And Israeli officials have been pointing to the U.S. and allied bombings of Germany and Japan during World War II, as I've been covering, as an example of, killing of civilians in a war. And, hundreds of thousands, if you combine the estimates of German civilians and Japanese civilians killed by, allied bombing, it gets into the millions. And we don't know the exact numbers. But, this comparison includes dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is what they're talking about. And Lindsey Graham has previously referenced this as well. When the conflict, the current fighting first started after the Hamas attack, Graham said that if Israel did not do something similar to what the U.S. did in World War II, then it would be making a mistake. He said, quote, "Gaza is going to look like Tokyo and Berlin at the end of World War II when this is over. And if it doesn't look that way, Israel made a mistake," end quote. And again, he mentioned Tokyo. And the firebombing of Tokyo was one of the most brutal things that happened in that war. They estimate 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. And I know this is kind of a common theme of the stories that I've been covering lately, as the top stories is the fact that there's all these people in the U.S. and Israel basically accepting that there's going to be a lot of civilian casualties. There already clearly are a lot of civilian casualties. And I think it's just the reason why I want to keep focusing on this is because this is a war being funded by the U.S. government. Countries downgrade their ties with Israel over the Gaza bombing. So this is from the Libertarian Institute by Kyle Anzalone. So a trio of South American countries, along with Jordan, have downgraded ties with Israel over the onslaught in Gaza. According to Palestinian sources, the Israeli military operations in Gaza have killed nearly 9,000 people. On Tuesday, Bolivia took the most extreme step and cut all ties with Israel. So that's pretty significant to see Bolivia do that. And they said that the decision that Bolivia, quote, "decided to break diplomatic relations with the Israeli state in repudiation and condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive taking place in the Gaza Strip," end quote. Israel accused them of capitulating to terrorism, of course. Colombia and Chile announced that they would recall their ambassadors from Israel. So not quite severing ties, but withdrawing their ambassadors, which is a significant diplomatic move. And Jordan also joined the South American nations in downgrading ties with Israel. The foreign ministry announced that it was recalling its ambassador. So I think it's significant to see three countries in Latin America, doing this. These aren't Arab countries. These are, countries on the other side of the world that are taking steps to reduce relations with Israel over what they're doing in Gaza. So Ukraine and some European countries are ramping up a lobbying push in the U.S. to get Americans to back more aid to Kiev. Ukrainian officials are seeking new long-range rockets and accelerated training programs. The propaganda push comes after a Time magazine article portrayed Kiev in disarray and as a hotbed for corruption. So according to Politico, quote, "Ukrainian officials and allies in Europe are ramping up their lobbying campaign in the U.S. for new weapons and training," end quote. The authors cite a recent Ukrainian delegation that toured America with a wish list that included they want U.S. Marine Corps training on conducting ship-to-shore operations, new air defenses to take down the Russian glide bombs that are devastating Ukrainian forces, and the long-range single-warhead version of the Army Tactical Missile System, that's the ATACMS. And the Biden administration secretly shipped ATACMS to Ukraine last month, but they gave them the cluster bomb version that has a shorter range than the single warhead, but still it has a pretty decent range, and it gives Ukraine the ability to fire cluster bombs very far, which is just insane. So the representatives of the Ukrainian government are attempting to adapt their message to the current American political landscape. You have a former Ukrainian Marine who is comparing Russians to Hamas. They're trying to tie it all together like Blinken did the other day. We got to keep funding Israel's war. We got to keep funding the war in Ukraine because, they're facing evil like Russia, Hamas, and China's watching. They just want to put all this stuff together.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
I believe there's never been a better time than now. There are a lot of people who are disgusted with what's going on. And I'm not just saying that, as a thought. It's a fact. When you look at the numbers, polls by Gallup poll, where people look at politicians lower than they do used car salesmen. So there's really been a time. This is the time now to have some dramatic change. And again, it's either occupy peace or die in war, as we say. Judge, you have an article coming out tomorrow, and it relates to what we're talking about in so many different ways, and how we're losing our freedom and peace. And it's about a great man in Moscow. When the Trump administration obtained an indictment of Edward Snowden for violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. Oh, 1917, huh? It was a wonderful time. This is under the Woodrow Wilson administration.
And the most repressive.
Yep.
The most repressive. I mean, Wilson arrested college students for reciting the Declaration of Independence out loud in front of draft offices. And his argument was, well, if people listen to this stuff that Jefferson wrote, they might be deterred from registering for the draft, so we arrested the students. What about the First Amendment, Mr. President? Oh, the First Amendment only prohibits Congress from interfering with freedom of speech. It doesn't prohibit the president. This is the former professor of constitutional law at Princeton University making this argument, which if made on a law exam, you'd get an F.
Yeah, and you graduated Princeton.
Yes.
And this is the same piece of scum crap that gave us World War I.
Right.
The Federal Reserve, federal income tax.
Right. The popular election of senators emasculating the states as states. And he created the administrative state, a government by experts. The government will keep your food safe. The government will keep the booze safe. Trust the government. Remember Ronald Reagan, the 9 most dangerous words in the English language. Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you.
Yeah. Many of us who believe that the Fourth Amendment means what it says, we're deeply critical of the government, and we remain so today. So please explain.
Well, Edward Snowden is the former outside contractor working with the NSA. He's also a former CIA agent who took 2 oaths, one to keep secret whatever his political bosses told him to keep secret, and the other to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. What do you do when the 2 oaths clash? What do you do when he learns that the very government entity that he's working for was engaged in the most massive violation of civil liberties in American history? The Snowden lesson is very instructive to us because it shows what big government will do. All of this is post 9/11. All this is instigated by the worst president in the post-World War II era, George W. Bush. Iran, Iraq, the Department of Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, mass spying on everybody.
Yep.
They have their FISA court. It's just a subterfuge. They go to the FISA court so they can claim they're going to a court to get a warrant. In fact, they're spying on everybody. So in 2006, and I'm sorry this is such a long answer, Gerald.
No, go on.
Bush and the Republican Congress enacted legislation that required every telecom service provider and every internet service provider to allow the federal government to be physically present at their mainframes. And today, the federal government, the NSA, guarded by armed guards carrying AR-15s, is physically present at every mainframe. You get off the elevator at the wrong floor at AT&T's headquarters in San Francisco, you'll be met by people pointing what look like machine guns at you. Welcome to America. Welcome to George W. Bush's America. What are they doing there? They are gathering communications in real time. Every keystroke. You think you deleted something, you haven't. Every keystroke pressed and every syllable articulated in the hands of the federal government, all in violation of the Fourth Amendment. That's what Snowden exposed. When he released this, he did so in Hong Kong to a select group of journalists, and then the government tried to arrest him, and he made his way to Moscow, where the U.S. government couldn't go. As he's landing in Moscow, the State Department switched off his passport, which told the Moscow people not to let him in, whereupon he said, Well, I'd rather be stateless than voiceless. Today, he is a dual Russian and American citizen and the model of personal courage in a free society for exposing what the government did. I once interviewed him with Ron Paul, the three of us.
Wow.
Ron and I were in Texas. Snowden was on a huge flat screen. We were in front of an audience of a few thousand in Moscow. And I made the argument that what he did is absolutely protected free speech, and that I believed the court would accept that argument and the indictment against him would be thrown out. And he said, Judge, I agree with you, but in order to do that, I have to come back into the United States, and I'm not so sure how I'll be treated by the government. Now, this is the Trump administration which indicted him. And then Trump himself, in an unguided moment, said, oh, that guy Snowden, he should be executed. And then some of us spoke to the president. And then he did a 180. And he said to me, should I pardon him? I said, yes, you absolutely should pardon him. And you should ask your government to instruct the DOJ to dismiss the indictment. Well, it didn't happen. Small world, Trump now stands indicted of the very same charge, the very same statute, the very same section of that statute that his DOJ charged Snowden with.
No wonder the legacy media are terrified. The last thing they need and want are people from across the political spectrum, voices from throughout the culture, recognizing, hey, wait a minute, we all have more in common with one another than we do with this set of interests that are trying to control our free speech and trying to proliferate ideas and even medicines. In a German population study, no healthy children aged 5 to 17 died of COVID. All deaths were in kids with a comorbid condition. Of course, that's very sad, it's awful, it's tragic, it's also important information that in an awakening society we should have access to and should make decisions based upon. US public health officials are not only misinformation spreaders, they're international outliers. The World Health Organization in March came as close as it's ever come to saying healthy children should not get the COVID vaccine, deeming the shot a low priority for healthy young people. I suppose it's hard for the WHO to even be unbiased because look at the way that they are funded. Of course, they receive considerable sums from governments, but also from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who also invest heavily in vaccine companies. So when it comes to simple declarations or proclamations about what might be good for your children, what might be good for the health of the world, there are competing factors. It's, I suppose, comparable to the discourse around military activity around the world. If apparently neutral voices are biased in favor of a certain type of expenditure and particular types of outcome, how can you trust the discourse? If pundits are not declared as having affiliations with the military-industrial complex or Big Pharma, or funded in some way by Big Pharma or the military-industrial complex, the information you get is biased. That's why it's really dangerous to have people that you might not agree with, like Bill Maher or Candace Owens or Joe Rogan, speaking kind of freely to enormous audiences that are now starting to think, oh yeah, maybe I won't give my children that shot. Fortunately, there are huge numbers of children in America particularly that are obese because of the irresponsible practices of filling them up with corn syrup and crazy glucose and mad sugar and pricing healthy foods out of the reach of many ordinary people, almost as if there's a convergence of interests that ensure that you're like a little larvae in a blob of glucose waiting for various medications to intervene in your inevitable bad health. In a New England Journal of Medicine analysis, of 136 people hospitalized for vaccine-induced myocarditis, 2 were in a critical condition and one 22-year-old died. The CDC, instead of making public its investigations into children dying immediately after the COVID vaccine, has been busy colluding with big tech to shut down scientific debate and censor true patient stories. That's the kind of sentence that I, after all this time, find difficult to say and difficult to believe. What? They're shutting down debate when children are why is that happening? Because I'll tell you why. Because it's too nefarious to contemplate, really. How does that happen just because of bureaucratic inertia or lack of communication or versions of an accident? It starts to seem evil. Specifically, it's been slapping the misinformation label on medical viewpoints when they differ from its own Ministry of Truth. Indeed, the biggest propagator of misinformation during the pandemic has been the US federal government. I think at this point, trust in the American government, trust in their health organizations and agencies that were supposed to be guiding us through what we were told was a uniquely horrific event where unique measures had to be taken in place, there is no reason for trust because there's been no, I mean, on an interpersonal level, you would expect kind of an acknowledgement and an apology. We're so wrong about all of that. And I can sort of envisage a way out if that's what was happening, but that isn't what's happening. What's continuing to happen is a recommendation of a medicine that now we know a lot more about. And yet the authenticity and honesty is still lagging way behind. And all you can conclude from that is that there's an agenda. This is from the Telegraph in the United Kingdom, talking about many of these issues, including the censorship of discussion around them. People left injured or bereaved from vaccines are being forced to speak in code online about their symptoms for fear of censorship, the COVID inquiry has heard. Baroness Hallett, the inquiry's chair, was also told at a hearing on Wednesday that healthcare workers were afraid to speak out about side effects they'd had from the jab over fears they would be punished by their bosses. It comes as campaign groups representing hundreds of people who suffered illness or lost loved ones after being vaccinated will be allowed to give evidence to the public inquiry. Anne Morris, KC, representing UKCV Family, Vaccine Injured Bereaved UK, and the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group told the inquiry, censorship is a very real issue for the vaccine injured and bereaved. I suppose what we're seeing now is the fruition of matters discussed and considered at the advent of the introduction of the vaccine. Hey, they've been given this indemnity and Pfizer aren't going to reveal these files to 75 years in the future. Well, now the people that have been injured and damaged are beginning to demand some form of compensation for their injuries. Their support groups have been shut down by social media platforms and their experience is censored by the mainstream media. They have to speak in code online for fear of having the only source of support taken away from them. My child died of tomato ketchup. Maybe I gave my child a bit too much tomato ketchup. And the government shouldn't have told us that that tomato ketchup was safe. I mean, when you think about it, they've not even done any trials on that tomato ketchup. And they told us that it stopped transmission when they'd never even tested whether or not it stopped transmission. And do you know that the ketchup that they made in the lab is different from the one that they gave to the people? Wait a minute, these people aren't discussing ketchup, are they? What? Is ketchup bad for you? I eat a lot of that stuff. No, you're fine with ketchup. Phew. We represent one nurse who wishes to remain anonymous. Very wise, Ms. Morris added. She doesn't want her work colleagues to know about her vaccine reaction because she isn't sure of the response she will encounter. 2 years ago, prior to her vaccine, she had a senior position working 12-hour night shifts. She's a single parent and her family relies on her income. 4 days after her second COVID vaccine, the nurse experienced period bleeding for no apparent reason, and 3 days later was diagnosed with bilateral large volume pulmonary embolism, a type of blood clot in the lungs with a right heart strain. Ms. Morris added she's battled for 2 years and now she's managing one 9-hour shift per week in a different role entirely, but that shift is still extremely challenging for her due to ongoing symptoms. Her life has been turned upside down, she's undergone significant trauma, yet cannot speak about the cause for fear of recrimination. Boo! Anti-vaxxer! Shame on you! Anti-vaxxer! Another example was given of a specialist theatre nurse who was diagnosed with vaccine-induced pulmonary fibrosis, a serious and lifelong lung disease which currently has no cure. She was told she would lose her job if she didn't take the vaccine, Ms. Morris said. So despite her misgivings, she went ahead because she's a single mother of 2 children. Now those children are her carers. Hooray! Support key workers, support the NHS, draw a rainbow in your window. Take that vaccine! I think it might make me ill. Your children can look after you. I believe the children are the future. Well, they better be, because the future's here, and the future's appalling.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
But interestingly enough, I mean, in the Israeli media, there's much more of a debate on what happened on October 7th than there is in the U.S. And you have, for example, I don't know, I'm sure you know Max Blumenthal, who he is, in The Gray Zone, which I think is a great publication. They came out with, Max came out with a story a couple of days ago, simply following the Israeli press, primarily Haaretz, and a couple of TV stations. But the testimony of those people who were hostages and other information shows that things didn't really happen the way they are being presented. You know, it turns out the Israelis, and this is understandable because governments screw up all the time. They can't do anything right. It turns out that the Israeli army seems like they used tanks and they blew up a lot of these houses in the kibbutz. That's why so many of the bodies were burned. And so many people were shot. They used Apache helicopters to shoot a lot of people, including a lot of the hostages. So there's always a lot more than meets the eye to these things, and they come out slowly. And, you know, when you start to see the truth, just like in 9/11, you started a few years later thinking, well, hang on, there were so many warnings and nobody listened, nobody paid attention. What's that all about? You know, I think you're starting to hear some of that, but the anger is too raw and too fresh. But the problem is, Tom, now you have, as of the time we're recording this, I think over 8,000 Palestinians killed, including 3,000 children. We're talking on Monday. I was just reading that the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital has just been hit by Israel, the cancer ward. So you see a lot of this happening. You see a lot of lives being destroyed, but you talk about kill them all. You can't kill them all. It just can't. It can't be done. And so my hope is that if an Israeli who's living there really wants to continue, they would shy away from the extremists and the neocons who say, "Oh yeah, well let's hit Iran. That sounds like a good idea." No way. I mean, if you hate Israel, the number one thing you'd want them to do is to hit Iran or provoke Hezbollah, because it's going to be a lot more Jewish Israelis dead. It's just a bad idea. This is not the Iran of the mid-1980s. Let's just put it that way.
So can you describe the best and worst case scenarios for us as you see them?
Well, we have the Speaker of the House who went on Hannity and urged the Israelis to attack Iran. That's not a good idea. And these guys aren't always the smartest bulbs in the bunch, and I would say definitely he's not. But like you say, the world is different now. And if you have an Israel attacking Iran, the Russians now have an increasingly potent alliance with Iran, let's put it that way. Plus, the Russians feel themselves very vulnerable in Syria. They, in fact, just moved 1,000 more troops into Syria. They have a base there in Tartus and other facilities in Syria. If Israel attacks Iran, there's also going to be an effort to finish the business in Syria. That's what the neocons want more than anything else, is to finish the business in Syria. So if the Israelis listen to the neocons in the U.S., then they're going to find the worst case scenario probably for everyone, which is getting Iran involved, getting Hezbollah involved, getting Hamas even more involved from wherever they are now, and getting the rest of the Arab world. Now, Erdogan, I think, does a lot of talking, and I think he talks out of both sides of his face. He has an enormous Sunni constituency in Turkey. His base are religious Muslims in Turkey, and he gave a fiery speech over the weekend about we need to go into Gaza and take care of these guys and save our people. Now, I think a lot of it was just a lot of hot rhetoric. Nevertheless, it's going to be hard to contain, as you point out, hundreds of millions of people in that vicinity that are going to be inflamed. You can't kill them all, even with their nukes. So the worst scenario would be to listen to the neocons and to escalate. The best scenario, and I think ironically we're going to start seeing it from the BRICS countries, from what we call the Global South, who now are very busy in the General Assembly of the UN for all of its faults, busy in the General Assembly trying to put forth new proposals and I think there was one that just was voted on a couple of days ago. And it turns out the U.S. is in a very small minority. Only 14 other countries voted with the U.S., voted against the proposal by Jordan for a truce. So I think it was France, the UK, and Germany voted against us. So you're finding the U.S. more isolated in the General Assembly, in the UN. So I think you're going to start to see some more momentum among the BRICS nations, among the previously non-aligned countries that are becoming aligned because of U.S. aggressive foreign policy. The best kind of solution would be for it to become obvious, even to Joe Biden or whoever's pulling the strings, even to them, that you are isolated. And probably with the phone call, Biden or whoever does this talking could say, listen, Bibi, we've got to pull the plug on this, because they did it before. Netanyahu pulled out of Gaza before, and this is something I was just re-looking at the other day when he got a call from the U.S. president saying, look, it's about enough right now. If things are getting hot, you need to pull back. And I think that could happen and look for some kind of truce. So that's the best case scenario. The world slowly but surely gets more and more opposed to the U.S. position. And the pressure on Biden, these 11 points that he's just lost in the polls, he starts looking at that and thinking, we got to fix this problem somehow. Give me some sort of a solution.
Well, now let's finish up with this. And then I want to say a little something about the Ron Paul Institute. But obviously, if I turn on a cable news network, I'm going to get the standard line. I know that. I know that if I go to, if Foreign Affairs puts on an event, I'll probably get the standard line. Although occasionally with Foreign Affairs, you might get a few dissident voices here and there. But generally, everybody knows what the standard line is. But I have this sense, though, that even though the political classes are out to lunch on it, and the newspapers and the major networks are out to lunch on it, I have a feeling that there is nevertheless a growing feeling of skepticism, maybe among people who aren't so powerful, who aren't opinion molders, but there are more people who won't necessarily be fooled the next time. Do you think I'm right about that, or is that wishful thinking?
I'd like to think you're right. It's frustrating, and I'm sure Scott Horton feels it. Anyone who's dumb enough to have gone into foreign affairs must feel it, who's on the right side, because, it's the only profession on earth where if you're right, you get kicked in the teeth, and if you're wrong, you get a promotion. You can be Vicky Newland. So it's a thankless task, but I do think that you're seeing a lot more people who are skeptical. As Dr. Paul always says, it's the challenges for us getting our message out and under overwhelming odds. We don't have cable, we don't have anything, we just have a little show, and all of us have our own shows. Getting it out with overwhelming odds against it, and our own inadequacies. I'm speaking for myself only. Inadequacies of delivering the message in an understandable, palatable form. It's not easy to do, especially when people have been so brainwashed for so long. It's a real challenge, but we should be rejoicing in a way, despite all the sadness and bloodshed, because this is our time. This is the time where we can say, look, everything has clearly failed. Non-interventionism is the solution to our problems, and here's why. So it's just a question of how best can we do it?
Senator Graham, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be judgmental, but it looks like he doesn't care. He's mincing no words.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look for all the causes of war and what's going on over there right now, and people that encourage these problems, and of course, I blame our foreign intervention overseas and foreign policy, because and that plus the international organizations like the United Nations and NATO, and then our money, and the money is passed out for political reasons. And even if we wanted to be cautionary with the money and say, you can't do this, this is to help some people here and limit it, it doesn't matter. So that's why the founders were correct. They gave no authority for us to take money from poor people in this country and give it to rich benefactors to fight wars overseas. And then we come in and we chime in and we have, senators that are so well known and say, well, if they get our money and start killing people, and it's, in this case, it's Israel that we're talking about getting the money, but that could be applied to almost any group, and sometimes on both sides, or very often, we send it to both sides and they get together. So the whole principle is wrong. But this caught our attention, and I thought we should express ourselves, exactly how this could be prevented. And I think constitutional government and a non-interventionist foreign policy and a little bit morality, we wouldn't have to worry about this. And probably Senator Graham would have a harder time becoming a senator.
Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, his first action is to start giving money away overseas. But we want to go ahead and recognize one thing that he's done that we agree with. And this is from Jonathan Turley's website. Put the next one up if you can. Republicans joined Democrats in defeating the censure of Representative Tlaib. Now, regardless of what you think about Rashida Tlaib, I think she is Palestinian, and she's been very critical of Israel's behavior in Gaza. And so there are some group in the House that wanted to censure her for what she said. And now Jonathan Turley writes, I was impressed by the comments of Speaker Mike Johnson on the measure and the 23 GOP members who took the unpopular step of voting against the measure, even though they disagreed with her viewpoints. And go to the next one. Here's where Johnson explained himself. In an appearance with Fox host Sean Hannity last night with other GOP members, Johnson explained that he opposed such measures in the interest of free speech. He noted that members say controversial things all the time, and that it is a slippery slope to use such disciplinary measures in a tit-for-tat pattern. So good for him.
When people reach this point, you really have to say, great, great, great.
Yeah.
But we keep wondering, but we encourage people, put this whole thing together and apply those same principles to some other issues too.
Yeah.
But, who knows where. He was probably pretty good on, the freedom of speech during the COVID epidemic, my guess would be. But it's like some people would pick one but not the other one and say, well, public health is a different story and we have to stop this and we should close it down. Or they might want to regulate the internet for a different reason instead of just saying what he has said about this. So, yes, I think he deserves a compliment. We ought to give him a star for today.
Star for the day, that's right.
And just look at the attitude about how many children have been killed over in the Middle East. And it seems to be a lot of people aren't too worried about the kids either who are getting killed. Maybe Senator Graham could talk about that.
Yeah, no, he likes that. Well, I just out of curiosity, I looked it up. So the first thing Mike Johnson wanted to do was send $106 billion overseas, divided between Ukraine and Israel, not equally, but divided between the two. $106 billion overseas on these useless wars. Well, I looked up the cost of SNAP, which is the welfare program. Put that next one up. In fiscal year 2021, the government spent about $111 billion on SNAP. So they're virtually identical costs. One, however, is welfare for the poor, which is SNAP. But the other is welfare for the rich, which is U.S. sending money overseas, which actually just goes to our military-industrial complex. Both of them are welfare. One's for the poor and one's for the rich.
So you're picking on the rich welfare recipients. Well, that's why the principle of transfer of wealth, taking money out of people's wallets, stealing it through inflation, and assuming that the government owns everything you earn, and they let you spend your first penny by permission.
Yeah.
They have control of your income.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to the next one, and this is a short one, but it needs to be said because they voted on HRES 559, I think it was yesterday, and it was declaring that it's the policy of the U.S. that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is not acceptable. Now, you remember these kinds of resolutions in the run-up to the Iraq War. Literally about every other week, there'd be another one. And it would be, this is just a sense of Congress, just a sense of Congress. Well, Thomas Massie was the only Republican no vote on this, and this is the second time in a week that he's taken a tough vote, and he's going to get hammered. They're going to put someone up against him, and he's going to get hammered. But he explained himself why he voted that way, if you put the next one on. Because of the language, he read the bill, and this is down in the resolved clauses. It says that the United States will use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Now, he circled that and said, I do not want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but I will not vote to give Joe Biden this power. All means necessary. And they snuck that in. Go to the next clip because this is the bill here, not surprisingly entered in by Mr. McCall, the biggest warmonger, one of the biggest, H-Res 559. And then go to the next one. Here are some of the resolve clauses. Now, this is where the enacting clauses of a resolution is. This is the meat of it. The other stuff is just sort of the coding, right? But it's this policy of the U.S. that we will use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a weapon. I almost read that, Dr. Paul, as an authorization for force.
Yeah, right. You know, one thing they do when they're debating what a country can do or prevent it from doing is Israel has the right of self-defense, as if that's the final thing. But I'm for the right of self-defense. Matter of fact, I had at times have voted for the right of Israel for self-defense when there weren't very many other, like no other Republican did it, because I did believe that they have a right of self-defense. But that doesn't mean that it means that it's limited to it. Why is it that all countries should have the right of self-defense? But that isn't what they're saying. I mean, it's meant to be targeted. It reminds me of the attitude of all Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Of course they do. But can you imagine getting into trouble because you've accepted, well, morally, all lives matter.
Yeah.
And I sort of come from that position, and sometimes very small human life. I think that all lives do matter, and if it's totally ignored, I think society deteriorates, and there's a little bit of deterioration going on in this country.
Yeah.
A culture of violence. Americans now suffer from a culture of violence. It is easy to reject the initiation of violence against one's neighbor, but it's ironic that the people arbitrarily and freely anoint government officials with monopoly power to initiate violence against the American people, practically at will. Because it's the government that initiates force, most people accept it as being legitimate. Those who exert the force have no sense of guilt. It is believed by too many, that governments are morally justified in initiating violence supposedly to do good. They incorrectly believe that this authority has come from the consent of the people. The minority, or victims of government violence, never consented to suffer the abuse of government mandates, even when dictated by the majority. Victims of TSA excesses never consented to this abuse. This attitude has given us a policy of initiating war to do good as well. It is claimed that war to prevent war for noble purposes is justified. This is similar to what we were once told that, quote, destroying a village to save a village, close quote, was justified. It was said by a U.S. Secretary of State that the loss of 500,000 Iraqis, mostly children, in the 1990s as a result of American bombs and sanctions was worth it to achieve the good we brought to the people of Iraq. And look at the mess that Iraq is in today. Government use of force to mold social and economic behavior at home and abroad has justified individuals using force on their own terms. The fact that violence by government is seen as morally justified is the reason why violence will increase when the big financial crisis hits and becomes a political crisis as well. First, we recognize that individuals shouldn't initiate violence. Then we give the authority to the government. Eventually, the immoral use of government violence, when things go badly, will be used to justify an individual's right to do the same thing. Neither the government nor individuals have the moral right to initiate violence against another, yet we are moving toward the day when both will claim this authority. If this cycle is not reversed, society will break down. When needs are pressing and conditions deteriorate and rights become relative to the demands and the whims of the majority, it's then not a great leap for individuals to take it upon themselves to use violence to get what they claim is theirs. As the economy deteriorates and the wealth discrepancy increase, as they already are occurring, violence increases as those in need take it in their own hands to get what they believe is theirs. They will not wait for a government rescue program. When government officials wield power over others to bail out the special interests, even with disastrous results to the average citizens, they feel no guilt for the harm they do. Those who take us into undeclared wars with many casualties resulting never lose sleep over the deaths and the destruction their bad decisions caused. They are convinced that what they do is morally justified, and the fact that many suffered just can't be helped. When the street criminals do the same thing, they too have no remorse, believing that they are only taking what is rightfully theirs. All moral standards become relative, whether it's bailouts, privileges, government subsidies, or benefits for some from inflating a currency. It's all part of a process justified by a philosophy of forced redistribution of wealth. Violence or a threat of such is the instrument required and unfortunately is of little concern of most members of Congress. Some argue it's only a matter of fairness, that those in need are cared for. There are two problems with this. First, the principle is used to provide a greater amount of benefits to the rich than to the poor. Second, no one seems to be concerned about whether or not it's fair to those who end up paying for all the benefits. The costs are usually placed on the backs of the middle class and are hidden from the public eye. Too many people believe government handouts are free, like printing money out of thin air and there's no cost. That deception is coming to an end. The bills are coming due, and that's what the economic slowdown is all about. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. It is the tool for telling the people how to live, what to eat and drink, what to read, and how to spend their money. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected. Granting to government even a small amount of force is a dangerous concession, limiting government excesses versus a virtuous moral people. Our Constitution, which was intended to limit government power and abuse, has failed. The founders warned that a free society depends on a virtuous and moral people. The current crisis reflects that their concerns were justified. Many politicians and pundits are aware of the problems we face, but spend all their time in trying to reform government. The sad part is that the suggested reforms almost always leads to less freedom, and the importance of a virtuous and moral people is either ignored or not understood. The new reforms serve only to further undermine liberty. The compounding effect has given us the steady erosion of liberty and the massive expansion of debt. The real question is, if it is liberty we seek, should most of the emphasis be placed on government, reform, or trying to understand what a virtuous and moral people means and how to promote it? The Constitution has not prevented the people from demanding handouts for both rich and poor in their efforts to reform the government while ignoring the principles of a free society. All branches of our government today are controlled by individuals who use their power to undermine liberty and enhance the welfare warfare state, and frequently their own wealth and power. If the people are unhappy with the government performance, it must be recognized that government is merely a reflection of an immoral society that rejected a moral government of constitutional limits on power and love of freedom. If this is the problem, all the tinkering with thousands of pages of new laws and regulations will do nothing to solve the problem. It is self-evident that our freedoms have been severely limited, and the apparent prosperity we still have is nothing more than leftover wealth from a previous time. This fictitious wealth based on debt and benefits from a false trust in our currency and credit will play havoc with our society when the bills come due. This means that the full consequence of our lost liberties is yet to be felt. But that illusion is now ending. Reversing a downward spiral depends on accepting a new approach. Expect the rapidly expanding homeschooling movement to play a significant role in the revolutionary reforms needed to rebuild a free society with constitutional protections. We cannot expect a federal government-controlled school system to provide the intellectual ammunition to combat the dangerous growth of government that threatens our liberties. The internet will provide the alternative to the government media complex that controls the news and most political propaganda. This is why it's essential that the internet remains free of government regulation. Many of our religious institutions and secular organizations support greater dependency on the state by supporting war, welfare, and corporatism, and ignore the need for a virtuous people. I never believed that the world or our country could be made more free by politicians if the people had no desire for freedom. Under the current circumstances, the most we can hope to achieve in the political process is to use it as a podium to reach the people, to alert them of the nature of the crisis and the importance of their need to assume responsibility for themselves. If it is liberty that they truly seek, without this, a constitutionally protected free society is impossible. If this is true, our individual goal in life ought to be for us to seek virtue and excellence and recognize that self-esteem and happiness only comes from using one's natural ability in the most productive manner possible, according to one's own talents. Productivity and creativity are the true source of personal satisfaction. Freedom and not dependency provides the environment needed to achieve these goals. Government cannot do this for us. It only gets in the way. When the government gets involved, the goal becomes a bailout or a subsidy, and these cannot provide a sense of personal achievement. Achieving legislative power and political influence should not be our goal. Most of the change, if it is to come, will not come from the politicians, but rather from individuals, family, friends, intellectual leaders, and our religious institutions. The solution can only come from rejecting the use of coercion, compulsion, government commands, and aggressive force to mold social and economic behavior. Without accepting these restraints, inevitably the consensus will be to allow the government to mandate economic equality and obedience to the politicians who gain power and promote an environment that smothers the freedoms of everyone. It is then that the responsible individuals who seek excellence and self-esteem by being self-reliant and productive become the victims.
So the House on Thursday passed a bill to provide Israel with $14.3 billion in military aid, a strong show of support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza, which has killed over 9,000 people so far. The Republican-authored bill would cut funds from the Internal Revenue Service to pay for Israel's aid, and this has drawn opposition from Democrats. So the bill passed in a vote of 226 to 196. Only 12 Democrats voted in favor, and it didn't get all that opposition from Democrats because they oppose sending new weapons to Israel. It's because they don't want to cut from the IRS. Two Republicans voted against the bill. Thomas Massie, who's been voting against all this Israel stuff, and you know he's been really good on this issue. Marjorie Taylor Greene also voted against it. Due to the IRS cuts that are included in the bill, the White House has threatened to veto it, and the Democrat-controlled Senate is working on its own version. So Democrats expressed frustration at the GOP bill, saying it will only delay getting more weapons to Israel, which already receives $3.8 billion in military aid from the U.S. each year. And when this thing first, after the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, the U.S. started shipping additional military aid to Israel using some other funds that they had available.
Isn't that great? A house of fucking clowns. Who the fuck are you to steal my money to go give it to slaughter innocent people? Israel's the 18th richest country in the world. Taking my fucking money as I work my ass off and stealing your money? What a joke.
So this is Brian Mast. He's a Republican from Florida and a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces. He's a former IDF soldier. And he has dismissed the idea that there are innocent Palestinian civilians, and he made these comments in a debate on the House floor on Wednesday. So he said, quote, "I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians as frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II," end quote. So again, invoking World War II, invoking the mass slaughter of German and Japanese civilians to justify the mass slaughter of Palestinian civilians. We're seeing this pretty commonly now from U.S. and Israeli officials. So Mast actually recently wore his IDF uniform on Capitol Hill, which just demonstrates, I mean, could you imagine a member of Congress wearing a military uniform of any other foreign country? I mean, it would be an outrage. And he showed up on Capitol Hill with his uniform on. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So he made the comments about Palestinian civilians while the House was debating the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act, which is a bill that requires sanctions on alleged Hamas supporters. The bill requires presidential waivers to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza and the West Bank, and that will slow down the delivery of food, medicine, and other supplies to civilians. If every delivery needs a waiver, that would really slow things down. And so Hezbollah attacked 19 Israeli positions simultaneously along the border, prompting a retaliatory assault from Israel a day before an anticipated speech by the group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. So this is kind of a big deal. They announced that Nasrallah was giving this speech earlier in the week, and the flare-ups on the Israel-Lebanon border continue. Israel's really been doing a lot of damage in Lebanon. Dozens of people have been killed, thousands displaced. Israel also evacuated a lot of people from northern Israel. So the strikes that happened on Thursday, they said that they targeted the military positions along the border simultaneously with guided missiles, artillery shelling, and other weapons. So some people think that Nasrallah is going to come out on Friday and basically declare war against Israel and call for a full mobilization. And the attacks and fighting has been escalating across the border. So we will see what happens. And then, of course, the thing, the big question is the U.S. going to directly intervene if Hezbollah directly intervenes? Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny acknowledged in comments to The Economist that the war in Ukraine is a stalemate and that there will most likely be no Ukrainian breakthrough. The general said, quote, "Just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that put us in a stalemate. There will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough," end quote. So China and the United States will discuss arms control and nuclear non-proliferation next week in the first talks of their kind in over 4 years. So the Chinese delegation will be led by Sung Xiaobo, who leads the Foreign Ministry's Arms Control Department. Wang Wenbin, a spokesman for the ministry, told a news conference on Thursday. So the U.S. will be represented by Mallory Stewart, the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance, according to the Wall Street Journal. So I think, again, this is good to see. The last time they held such talks was in July 2019. For a while there, the U.S. was trying to get China to join in on arms control talks with Russia, like trilateral arms control talks, nuclear arms control talks. But when it comes to Russia and China, that's just not enticing to China at all because their nuclear arsenal is much smaller than what the U.S. and Russia have. The U.S. and Russia both have around 6,000 nukes. The U.S. slightly less than 6,000, and Russia has just slightly more. And China, according to the current estimates, has 300, 400. The U.S. is claiming they have 500, I think, now. But still nothing close to what the U.S. and Russia have. So that offer was always a non-starter. But the U.S. and China could theoretically work out some kind of deal on deployments, prohibiting deployments in, Southeast Asia or in the Asia Pacific. There are things that the U.S. and China could work out on their own. But I'm pretty pessimistic about the state of U.S.-China relations, but still, I think it's good to see arms control talks.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
One, when all else fails, they take it to war. And that's what they've done. They do it all the time. The Netanyahu government was failing. People hated him. Protests going on. And as we talk about later on, and we've been writing in the Trends Journal, the facts that are coming out is that Netanyahu knew about this was going to happen, didn't want it, and they let it happen. And all those people who are protesting, now they're all supporting him. So anyway, this is, this is from several months ago. I do a podcast on Alex Jones on Monday. And this is the tweet we put out. Ready to die? Keep your mouth shut. Do what your government tells you and obey politicians. Swallow prostitute crap. World War III has begun. If we don't stop it, we'll be dead. We have to beat them. Here's what to do. One of the things to do is do anything you can, any way you want, in a peaceful way for the name of peace. You want to donate to Occupy Peace? I fight for peace. I have rallies. I do what I do. Whatever you want to do. If you don't do anything, you deserve to get wiped out. When we're all going to get wiped out, as if we don't stop what's going on in the Middle East. It's pure genocide in front of everybody's eyes. And I'm no longer supporting RFK Jr. Very heartbroken because I really believed in him. And he's so pro-Israel. And Max Blumenthal, a Jewish guy, did this clip with Jimmy Dore about a month or two ago, ripping into what RFK Jr. is saying. And Blumenthal goes to what they used to call Palestine. And, okay, so for all the people that say, no, it wasn't Palestine, again, from our Trends Journal, 2006, Crusades 2000. Regardless of what England's reasons or intentions, self-serving or otherwise, Crusades 2000 was set in motion by the 1917 Balfour Declaration that laid the foundation for Israel. Quote, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Establishment in Palestine. There's some fucking gangster fucking prick called His Majesty. And all you little fucking scumbags, don't send me your fucking emails about using the word fuck. You're a ballless little piece of shit. You're in a fight for your life, and you don't like the language? You don't like the language as slaughter is going on? The job, you're looking at the job numbers. The cost of labor unexpectedly declined in third quarter. This is from today. This is after the fucking feds, and it's in your Trends Journal, month after month after month after month, we're blaming inflation on higher labor costs. When labor costs are well below inflation numbers, and when you go to the real inflation numbers, they're more than double what they are according to John Williams' shadow stats. So now they're happy that labor costs are going down. Oh, the markets are going up as labor costs are going down, which means that people are getting poorer. But don't worry, the big companies are making money. That's all that counts. And they're counting a lot of nothing more than bullshit detected. Take precautions. Yeah, you better take precautions. Bullshit level, DEFCON 5. Yep. So that's the way I feel about the markets. And again, we said, and get these things, oh, you said it would crash. I said there was a high likelihood it would crash. But how about all the other trend forecasts we get right? And I also said that it would go down in September and October when I don't know who else was saying that. We said that back in July when the markets were going up in July when we said it. So save your fucking shit. Oh, commercial real estate lending slows down. Oh, the markets went up. Commercial real estate lending slowed down. You ready? The biggest victims have been office owners. who had to refinance expiring loans at a much higher rate. No one, it's all out of the news, the office building bust. It's one of our top trends. Out of the news, this thing is going to go down big and hard. But don't worry about it. Everybody's going to forget about it as we're all getting annihilated in nuclear war. Home prices hit record as sales fall. Oh, so now you have the median existing home sale rose 2.8% in September from a year earlier to $394,300, according to the National Association of Realtors. You ready? A home buyer needed an income of nearly $115,000 to afford the median priced U.S. home in August, assuming a 20% down payment. A home buyer, so that could be like one person. Median household income in the USSA is $74,000. You're a little short. Oh, the markets are going up. What, are you kidding me? Of course. The cost of labor unexpectedly declined in third quarter. Yep. Mentioned that already. Wage growth hits 2-year low. Oh, they were blaming wage growth for inflation, not the fucking cheap money that the Federal Reserve bankster gangsters put in there with zero interest rate policy. That didn't have a fucking thing to do with inflation. Not the trillions of dollars that Trump and Biden dumped in to fight the COVID war. Fake fucking money. That had nothing to do with inflation. It's labor costs. So the Fed, again, we said it, been saying it, again, only for a better part of the year. They're going to lower interest rates next year in the run-up to the presidential reality show because the bankster gangsters are running White House. That's the former Fed head, the one you just saw. Powell is the current Fed head. The former Fed head is our Treasury Secretary. The bankster gangsters are running the country. They're going to lower interest rates.
You will have noticed it's become increasingly difficult to oppose, for example, war and military action. It's become increasingly difficult to criticize big companies. And also, generally, we're living in a more and more fractured space. I would say we need more decentralization, more ability to freely communicate, more opportunity to form new alliances against the establishment interests that are plainly trying to control us. They're not interested in relatively insignificant figures like me. They are interested in total control of the population. And they're heading in the right direction because you know that legislation is being passed all around the world that allows them to penalize social media companies that promote or platform content that they don't like. Of course, it always starts with hate speech because they know, generally speaking, we are opposed to hate, but it always ends up advancing the interests of the powerful. The great criticism, other than the genocides, of communism was that it created vast centralized bureaucracies where ordinary people were irrelevant and could be controlled. Well, look at what you've got now. You've got vast centralized bureaucracies. Who is it that I'm arguing with? This has happened in real life as well. This has happened notably with the Grenfell situation. That's a tower block that burned down in this country. When you try and see whose fault it is, oh, this person subcontracted to that person, that firm subcontracted to that firm. It's very difficult to say who's causing this, who's behind this, where is power, who's in control. There are these vast, invisible, bureaucratic organizations where you can't actually access or purchase power. You can't say, well, hold on a minute. What are these community guidelines? Who do we talk to? What did we do wrong? Tell us so that we can amend it. That's literally Kafkaesque. Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. because he was arrested one morning. That's like how, of course, the trial starts. Who said it? What am I supposed to have done? I'm afraid we can't tell you that. What have I done? We can't tell you that. And corporations and the state are in lockstep together. That is truly what fascism means. There are other inflections. There are other exorcizations of that power. There are potentially minority groups that are persecuted. That is, of course, one of the worst aspects. There are new rules that are undemocratically brought about. But what we are seeing, I believe, is an advance towards centralized authoritarianism being oddly legitimized as protecting people and helping people and protecting a community. What community? Any of you that saw our interview with Dr. Robert Epstein will know that Google have an incredible amount of power when it comes to managing media spaces and news narratives. His work is incredible. He showed how, for example, Google can promote stories that could change the outcome of an election. Of course, if whenever you Google something, what comes up is favorable to one political party or one political movement, say, obviously that's going to influence the reality that people live within. Now, Google don't want anyone else doing that. Google don't want anyone anyone else offering an alternative version of reality, an alternative narrative. For example, a decentralized world where the individual is sacred, where community is sacred, where we have the maximum amount of ability to control our own communities through democracy, debate, discussion. The fact is that due to technologies, miraculous technologies like this, that have to a degree come about as a result of competition and capitalism, but also have received significant funding from, for example, the CIA in the early days of some of those organizations. Those are stories you're familiar with. They don't want anyone rising up now to give alternative versions of reality. For example, Rumble, our home. They don't want that happening, and here's further evidence of that fact. In a significant event leading up to the Republican presidential primary debate in August, Rumble was granted exclusive rights to provide a free online broadcast. However, it became apparent that Google search had buried references to Rumble's stream of the debate. Users searching for the debate stream on Google were ushered to links from YouTube, Fox News, and various news reports instead of Rumble. Remember, Rumble was streaming the presidential primaries for free, whereas Fox News was charging. So even if you just reduce yourself to a consumer, and believe me, they've reduced you to that, you're getting a worse deal even from that narrow and limiting perspective. This incident holds significant implications for digital free speech and competition in the online sphere. It also raises important questions about the role and responsibilities of dominant internet platforms in relation to smaller emerging entities. When we view this through the lens of censorship, it serves as a poignant reminder of how tech giants can shape what is accessible to users. Practices like these could lead to a monopolistic information environment where curiosity, choice, and access are limited. Rumble is currently in discovery regarding legal action against Google, accusing the tech behemoth of anti-competitive practices. Rumble alleges that Google is unfairly promoting its own video platform, YouTube, at the expense of competitors. Why does this matter? Because it becomes about free speech. It becomes about what information you have access to. It becomes about who determines what version of reality is promoted and what version of reality is de-amplified to the point you're not even aware that it's there. Ultimately, because of the ability for these monopolies to form powerful relationships with the state, it creates the possibility for centralization and authoritarianism on an unprecedented scale. If that gets underwritten by law, as is currently happening, you'll soon be in a space where you literally can't say anything that's anti-establishment. They've already created that principle by saying these things can never be said. You can't say that, you can't criticize this, you can't criticize that. Once you agree around anything, then you've established that principle, haven't you? Oh, there are certain things we agree you can't say. Yeah, I suppose so. You don't want people using racist or hateful language? Good, absolutely. And also, what about criticizing wars? What about criticizing COVID? What about criticizing Big Pharma? What about criticizing the state? Not just about shutting down alternative platforms, it's about promoting a particular news agenda. Remember, we continually tell you here on our channel, the function of the media is not to give you information. Here's some information, make your own choice. You might get that from a great journalist like Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald or Barry Weiss. Here's some information, you work it out for yourself. But what you'll get in legacy media is the amplification of the agenda of the powerful, the normalization of the agenda of the powerful. Oh, everyone's staying indoors now and wearing masks. Oh, okay, are we sure we've done enough tests? Yeah, tests have been done on that. Okay, everyone, this is going to happen now. These wars are happening. What, have we looked into that? Is there a peaceful solution? You're not allowed to discuss those things. So recognize that it's okay for us to disagree. It's all right. It's necessary. It's part of being human. But don't hand over that degree of power to centralized authoritarian regimes and organizations that do not have your best interests at heart, because they want you neutralized. That's what they primarily want. Neutralization. They want you neutered.
June 18th, 1787, pretty much started out with John Dickinson. So he made a motion. The Committee of the Whole agreed that the Articles of Confederation should be amended, quote, so as to render the government of the U.S. adequate to the exigencies, the preservation, and the prosperity of the Union. And that postponement was agreed by 10 states. And then Hamilton arose and began a speech which lasted the rest of the day that they were there. And he did not like either plan. And here from the notes from Madison, he was particularly opposed to that from New Jersey. What a surprise. Being fully convinced that no amendment of the Confederation leaving the states in possession of their sovereignty could possibly answer the purpose. Clearly, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, he did not like the states or the people of the states having any remaining sovereignty, final authority. He wanted it all in a central government. And he even talks about, well, he talks about getting rid of the states completely. But moving forward, before he gets into his 11-point plan, and I'm going to highlight a number of those, he spoke about what he considered, quote, the great and essential principles necessary for the support of government. These are the 5 essential principles for the support of government to Alexander Hamilton. Some of them maybe don't sound as crazy as the others, but this is what he thought was essential. And you can take from it whatever you would like. 1, an active and constant interest in supporting it. 2, the love of power. Men love power. That's exactly what it says. 3, a habitual attachment of the people. 4, and what a surprise, force. And this is basically what he was telling the states. I mean, it's not 100% certain that he was writing this in debate with the Anti-Federalists just after the Philadelphia Convention, but it's probable it was him saying, hey, we're going to come in, you guys got to ratify as it is, or you're going to get it whether you like it or not. So 4 is force, by which may be understood a coercion of laws or coercion of arms. Think about that in relation to the whiskey tax as well. 5, influence. Madison writes that he did not mean corruption, but a dispensation of those regular honors and emoluments, which produce an attachment to the government. Certainly when he was part of Washington's team in the government after ratification, he certainly handed out a lot of those regular honors and emoluments. So he put that type of thing in practice. Now, next up, he is going to get into his 11-point plan, but he first starts out by suggesting that getting rid of the states is actually a really good idea. He said if they were extinguished, he was persuaded that great economy might be obtained by substituting a general government. Now, he did not mean, however, to shock the public opinion by proposing such a measure. So he just pointing out, just offhand, that, well, it would be much more efficient if we got rid of these states and then we could just have one government telling everybody what to do at all times. Now, of course, they're going to still need people in more local positions, but he gets in that in a moment. He said, on the other hand, he saw no other necessity for declining it. So in other words, the only reason to say let's not get rid of the states is that not enough people in the general population would be on board with it. They're going to be shocked. He recognized he didn't want to shock the public opinion. He said the states are not necessary for any of the great purposes of commerce, revenue, or agriculture. Subordinate authorities, he was aware, would be necessary. There must be district tribunals, corporations for local purposes. In other words, get rid of the states. He wanted, whether either they're going to be states or districts, he basically was suggesting that the best way forward is to have one central government and some local officials that are basically merely corporations of that central government. So that was his approach. So let's get through some of these highlights of his actual plan. And the first one starts out with this. Again, June 18th, 1787. You'll be able to read it in full. It will be linked to in the show notes, along with everything else over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Hamilton writes, or says, he read through this, the supreme legislative power of the United States of America is to be vested in 2 distinct bodies of men, the one to be called the Assembly, the other the Senate, who together shall form the legislature of the United States, with power to pass all laws whatsoever, subject to the negative hereafter mentioned, so the veto power. But the power to pass all laws whatsoever. This was eerily similar to the British Declaratory Act of 1766, which Parliament gave the colonies after the colonists nullified the Stamp Act and they were forced to repeal to kind of save face. But then they turned around and they passed this act that said that they had powers over the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. So anyone who was paying attention to this was like, oh man, we want a general or a central government with power, all laws whatsoever. Is not too much different. And if you think about what the revolutionaries fought a war for independence to get away from, a big part of it, if not the root cause, was the Declaratory Act. The notion that there was a far-off parliament that could pass laws in all cases whatsoever. Paine put it this way: Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. So Hamilton is basically trying to establish the same system, the British system, that he was a part of getting away from. And Paine continued, and if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. Now, Thomas Jefferson talked about this kind of proposal. Of course, the proceedings at the Philadelphia Convention were mostly secret, but Jefferson had gotten his hands on some of James Madison's notes at some point, and here's a letter that he wrote to George Washington in 1792, pointing out that his objection to the Constitution was that it wanted a Bill of Rights. So he was concerned about a lack of a Bill of Rights, securing freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom from standing armies, trial by jury, and a constant habeas corpus act. Jefferson continues, Colonel Hamilton's objection was that it wanted a king and House of Lords. So Jefferson's pointing out that where I objected to the Constitution was I just wanted to see a Bill of Rights. What Hamilton didn't like was that it didn't have a king and a House of Lords. He also wished the general government should have power to make laws binding the states in all cases whatsoever. Jefferson was certainly aware of what that meant, especially when you're talking about going back to the Revolution and the Declaratory Act. Now, and then here's story number 2 from Jefferson in a letter to Benjamin Rush. He said, the room being hung around with a collection of the portraits of remarkable men, among them were those of Bacon, Newton, and Locke, very important people to the founding generation. Hamilton asked me who they were, as if he was clueless. Maybe he was being coy. Jefferson said, I told him they were my trinity of the 3 greatest men the world had ever produced, and then naming them. He paused for some time and then said, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar."
Part of the reason that they are able to do so much damage is people believe that we need these unconstitutional agencies, the alphabet agencies. And we saw, especially with COVID, that we'd be better off without them. They're probably still today pushing these shots, even though 98% of people know that they don't want to take it anymore. So the FDA, the CDC, WHO, all of these, in libertarians, we've been saying, no, you need the free market, not these government agencies, because the government agencies can also be captured. They could give you a false sense of security, and they can make corporations rich. But the argument is the opposite. No, if you didn't have these corporations would trample all over us. Well, you do have them, and the corporations are trampling all over us. And they don't catch. You can't expect them to catch all the little. People are very creative. They're in breaking laws, but they don't even catch the big stuff. They don't catch the Madoff. The other day we see Sam Bankman-Fried. There's the SEC. There's the financial regulators are out the wazoo, and all this takes place even with them there. So what good are they doing anybody? But they allow, whether willfully or not willfully, these major crimes to take place. So we libertarians are right. We would be much better without them. And the big pharma COVID thing was even bigger. They were going for 7 billion shots. That was the goal. They failed, but that was the goal. So we would be much better with a free market. We have a long way to go and a lot of education for people to accept such a thing. But hopefully all of these episodes are at least, strengthening our case that we need free markets and not all these alphabet agencies.
Easy to adapt this to monetary policy, and what I talk about quite frequently is that people who are really worried about inflation. Inflation to them is, the prices going up, not the printing of money. But if people get upset enough and they have the proper understanding, what do they have to do? They have to get rid of one big bureaucracy, and that would be the Federal Reserve, because the source of so much trouble comes from there, the economic intervention and the foreign policy intervention. But the other thing that's occurring, and there's a little bit of a monkey wrench put in, the development and the collusion of big government and big pharma. And they've done this for years. The first time I ever thought about that problem was when the FDA might withhold certain drugs for the benefit of those who have the drugs, and there would be competition. So there was a lot of politicking going on there. Now it's the government comes in and they take over and test it, and they will protect pharmaceutical companies. And up until just recently, they're making billions and billions of dollars. But it's nice to see the market. It's an odd way of being democratic and voting with their dollars. I don't need any more shots, and I think that is very good. But the other intrusion to fortify the whole thing about cultural Marxism and corporatism is getting government and big business. Banking is already there together and marching there. Now they're controlling medicine and the pharmaceuticals, and they've certainly done that with the military-industrial complex. But it's the Larry Finks of the world that I think people should be alerted to, because he's running a money market account, the largest in the world, I believe, or maybe second place on some days. Trillions, $10 trillion of money they operate. So they can change and alter the money. Some days their movements can be bigger than the Fed. And yet they work with the corporations, and they will tell people what they have to do, and they'll set some of the rules. And this is where this ESG stuff comes from. Have these socialistic rules that if your company doesn't follow these rules of aggressive socialization, you can't get the loan, or they'll block the loan. They'll control you through the monetary system, and they will work with the Federal Reserve and the government. And it's all for good reasons, because the ESG movement, these are wonderful things. You as a company, if you want to be part of our gang, you have to do some things. You have to be very conscientious about the environment, and they're not on the right side of that issue. They also want to have people follow certain social rules and regulations, and making sure that nobody gets ever discriminated against, all this perfection. People say, well, no, we don't want to do that. And also, it has to be that you have to satisfy government regulators too and follow the rules. And this ESG movement has has made it where if you don't have the credentials, they can hurt you on your stocks. They can make it difficult for you to get loans. It's a lot of them will capitulate. That's the only way we can do business. We have to play this game. So they invest their money and get approval from places like Larry Fink. So that to me, I think is very, very dangerous. We saw that, in so much of the COVID that people had to do it and listen to them, and then they got the approval. Otherwise, they lose their jobs. And so I think it's the big danger of what we're talking about is it advancing. Yes, corporatism is when government and business, work together. And some people say, well, this is just, friendly advice and this kind of stuff. But no, it gets bigger and bigger, and that's why it's called corporatism. And it's also why many people now are warning about, actually morphing into fascism. When business and government become one issue and one unit, you're on a road, if not already there, into a fascist system. We're not there yet, but I'd like to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent it.
Fantastic, Dr. Paul. I will finish up with my closing thoughts. Power relies on fear. Wherever you see mass fear, you can be sure that there is a government looking to take away liberty and corporations looking to take your money. Okay, and we are led from one fear event to another, and they're big enough to encompass enough people. Whether it was COVID, and we moved immediately to Ukraine. Once the Ukraine well dried up, and Ukraine is nowhere near going to win anything, it went right to the Middle East. And, I talked about the left. Now the right has abandoned everything. The MAGA is gone. There is no Make America Great Again, because now their focus is U.S. intervention in the Middle East. And with each of these events, our freedom and money are taken away. So Americans on both sides, left and right, have to snap out of this. We're being led by our emotions. And, think of all the, we need to worry about this country, and it's gone. Those red hats are empty, but it's very, very hard. These people that are in charge of the propaganda are so good. They're masters of it, to where everywhere you look, you will see the same message.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias. And agenda to control exactly what people think. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
And you'll see celebrities say the same thing, and athletes and sports teams. They all have the one message, and nobody wants to be different. They just go along with the crowd, because if they're different, they get kicked out of the crowd. So it's very tough, but for the few that think for themselves and take care of their families, when you see this stuff, when you see this mass, whatever they call it, hypnosis, psychosis, look the other way, beware, because people are getting taken to the cleaners again. Don't let it happen to you and your family.
Very good. The solution is available, it's understood, and we should work toward it, but it's perfection in many ways, and that is not about to happen, and it depends on the morality of the people, and that is that everybody gets to make their own choices. If you're in government, it hurts a lot of people, and it's hard to get out of it, just like we're working to get out of the damage that COVID did. But if you get your freedom and have your freedom, you get to keep all the money you earn, and you get to do what you want as long as you don't hurt people or steal. And then some people might still fail. They might not have a good product. They might not work hard enough. They might not have it. But then they say, see, I can't quite make it. I have to have help. So I'm going to the government. And the government can steal some money from somebody else and then take care of me. And that's the authoritarian approach. It's still there. It still works. And it's motivated because it's always based on a humanitarian argument. You don't care about people. I care about people. And I think the best way to care about people is to provide and promote personal liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
In conclusion, what are the greatest dangers that the American people face today that impede the goal of a free society? There are 5. The continuous attack on our civil liberties, which threaten the rule of law and our ability to resist the onrush of tyranny. Number 2, violent anti-Americanism that has engulfed the world. Because the phenomenon of blowback is not understood or denied, our foreign policy is destined to keep us involved in many wars that we have no business being in. National bankruptcy and a greater threat to our national security will result. Number 3, the ease in which we go to war without a declaration by Congress, but accepting international authority from the UN or NATO, even for preemptive wars, otherwise known as aggression. A financial political crisis as a number 4, a financial political crisis as a consequence of excessive debt, unfunded liabilities, spending, bailouts, and gross discrepancy in wealth distribution going from the middle class to the rich. The danger of central economic planning by the Federal Reserve must be understood. World government taking over local and U.S. sovereignty by getting involved in the issues of war, welfare, trade, banking, a world currency, taxes, property, ownership, and private ownership of guns must be addressed. Happily, there's an answer for these very dangerous trends. What a wonderful world it would be if everyone accepted the simple moral premise of rejecting all acts of aggression. The retort to such a suggestion is always, it's too simplistic, too idealistic, impractical, naive, utopian, dangerous, and unrealistic to strive for such an ideal. The answer to that is that for thousands of years, the acceptance of government force to rule over the people at the sacrifice of liberty was considered moral and the only available option for achieving peace and prosperity. What could be more utopian than that myth? Considering the results, especially looking at the state-sponsored killing by nearly every government during the 20th century, estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of people, it's time to reconsider this grant of authority to the state. No good has ever come from granting monopoly power to the state to use aggression against the people to arbitrarily mold human behavior. Such power, when left unchecked, becomes the seed of an ugly tyranny. This method of governance has been adequately tested, and the results are in. The reality dictates we try liberty. The idealism of non-aggression and rejecting the offensive use of force should be tried. The idealism of government-sanctioned violence has been abused throughout history and is the primary source of poverty and war. The theory of a society being based on individual freedom has been around for a long time. It's time to take a bold step and actually permit it by advancing this cause rather than taking a step backwards, as some would like us to do today. Today, the principles of habeas corpus, established when King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, is under attack in our own government. There's every reason to believe that a renewed effort with the use of the internet, that we can instead advance the cause of liberty by spreading an uncensored message that will serve to rein in government authority and challenge the obsession with war and welfare. What I'm talking about is a system of government guided by the moral principles of peace and tolerance. The founders were convinced that a free society could not exist without a moral people. Just writing rules won't work if the people choose to ignore them. Today, the rule of law written in the Constitution has little meaning for most Americans, especially those who work in Washington, D.C. Benjamin Franklin claimed, quote, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. John Adams concurred, quote, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. A moral people must reject all violence in an effort to mold people's beliefs or habits. A society that boos or ridicules the golden rule is not a moral society. All great religions endorse the golden rule. The same moral standards that individuals are required to follow should apply to all government officials. They cannot be exempt. The ultimate solution is not in the hands of the government. The solution falls on each and every individual with guidance from family, friends, and community. The number one responsibility for each of us is to change ourselves with hope that others will follow. This is of greater importance than the working on changing the government. That is secondary to promoting a virtuous society. If we can achieve this, then the government will change. It doesn't mean that political action or holding office has no value. At times, it does nudge policy in the right direction. But what is true is that when seeking office is done for personal aggrandizement, money, or power, it becomes useless if not harmful. When political action is taken for the right reasons, it's easy to understand why compromise should be avoided. It's also become clear why progress is best achieved by working with coalitions, which bring people together without anyone sacrificing his principles. Political action, to be truly beneficial, must be directed toward changing the hearts and minds of the people, recognizing that it's virtue and morality of the people that allow liberty to flourish. The Constitution or moral laws per se have no value if the people's attitudes aren't changed. To achieve liberty and peace, two powerful human emotions have to be overcome. Number one is envy, which leads to hate and class warfare. Number two is intolerance, which leads to bigoted and judgmental policies. These emotions must be replaced with a much better understanding of love, compassion, tolerance, and free market economics. Freedom, when understood, brings people together. When tried, freedom is popular. The problem we have faced over the years has been that economic interventionists are swayed by envy, whereas social interventionists are swayed by intolerance or of habits and lifestyles. The misunderstanding that tolerance is an endorsement of certain activity motivates many to legislate moral standards which should only be set by individuals making their own choices. Both sides use force to deal with these misplaced emotions. Both are authoritarians. Neither endorses voluntarism. Both views ought to be rejected. I have come to one firm conviction after these many years of trying to figure out the plain truth of things. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity for the maximum number of people worldwide is to pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land. And I yield back the balance of my